Raise your hands so we can get a microphone. Remember, so everybody can hear online. Who knows the answer?
Part B of ID.
IDEA.
IDEA.
IDA. I should say ID because short. But when we talk about Part B, I want to know what ages, where does that funding go? What ages does that cover? Raise your hand if you know the answer.
So, and hi, Ashley. For transitional, so that's from 16 and years older to, I think it's 23.
21.
21,
Correct
okay, yeah.
About transition, but Part B relates to funding from age 3 to 21. And I find that's the most misconception because people forget that Part B is 3 to 5. However, what we see happen sometimes is there are children like 3 to 5 years old that are still in early intervention programs, but they're under IEP. Because Part C is IFSP. So remember the difference between the two. So I like to drill people with that, because they asked a great question in terms of living youth, like independent living youth. I tell people one of the biggest things I had to think about as an advocate is think about your youth from ages 0 to 22. So I go by the Medicaid and Medicare because people forget it's a big access issue. And one of the things I'm working with currently in Alabama, at age 21, you don't have any audiology care at all. Medicaid, you kind of get stuck in this year, but I can't touch a person on Medicaid for audiology care and help them till 22. So there's just literally this gap year between and stuff. So that's a big access issue I see in terms of people who have hearing loss or are deaf themselves. So that's one of the things I think is really interesting, because when you start to look at the laws and different stuff and like how programs are set based on ages, I find there's a lot of parallels and stuff. So that's your pop quiz, because I know he mentioned the words Part B, Part C, and if you're not familiar with either. Well, okay, restate that. The Medicaid. Okay, sorry. I taught fast. All right, with Medicaid in Alabama, the law is right now, Medicaid for children ends at age 21. And that's when you have audiology services. So typically what I see as an advocate is you'll get coverage for hearing aid services like hearing screening, your second hearing screening, at least one hearing aid. It's really hard to get 2 hearing aids sometimes, but I typically see 1 hearing aid right now. But then they don't get any additional coverage, or there's not enough funding for the upgrade on hearing aids. Good news is though, Kessler Plant Americas, which is Kessler Plant manufacturer, just got approved for Alabama Medicaid 2 months ago. So it'll be interesting to see if children can get access to Kessler Plant technology, if that's what their parents choose, but how all that will hold up. And I already know for a fact on a federal level, Alabama Medicaid falls federal level. Kessler Plants are covered with 1 Kessler Plant, so they do the most deaf ear, if you want to know. So, but what's important to realize that after you age out of Medicaid, which I absolutely hate that word, age out, but it is reality. There is a gap year between age 21 to 22 where nobody wants to touch you because you have to wait till you turn 22 to access other professions. But at age 22, there's absolutely no coverage at all for audiology, any type of hearing technologies. So just know that. So, but I like to talk about that because then if you look back at Part B, it talks about those transition services and the funding from age 3 to 21, which is why Medicaid, that's how they based the age limits, was based on ID. Yeah. All right. History of self-advocacy movement. So for you guys, here's my contact information, and I have, again, the most updated PowerPoint version. To Brooke, I literally just added this slide because I realized nobody had my contact information if you want to get a hold of me. So I'll send that to you, Brooke, afterwards for Ken, or if I can shoot y'all email with the contact information. But if you want my contact information, here it is. This is my work email. And so I joke, you heard I was a retired public for physical therapist. I'm also a full-time deaf influencer on Instagram and TikTok. That's actually how my advocacy journey started. Was outside PT. I actually started going viral for sharing my stories as a lived experience as a deaf woman with Kessler Plant technology that wasn't signing, and people got interested with that. But I spoke a lot about the importance, like there has to be equitable funding, and we deserve to have our stories heard too. Like deafness is just not one side, just as every type of disability has its own needs. Same thing with the deaf community and our deafness both too. So this is my nonprofit, Center for Advancement of Next Gen Deaf. Our website is live, which is the www.cang.org. And we do have an Instagram, and TikTok's not as big on Kanji because I'm a woman, one woman show. And I just hired my first employee who's a audiologist because we're opening an audiology clinic this summer for pro bono services. So we're doing a lot of work. So our nonprofit does a lot of advocacy. So we do a lot of advocacy, but we do a lot of, we're trying to get into one of the biggest issues in Alabama. It is a 5-month wait list to get into children rehab services for a second screen, and another 5-month wait list to get a hearing aid if you choose amplification. And we talk about language acquisition and the Joint Commission for Hearing Infinite. You're supposed to meet the 1, 2, 3 benchmarks, but we're trying to push for the 1, 3, 6 benchmarks right now. 6. So things I do. So in the world of deafness, I really bridge my self-advocacy between healthcare, which I appreciate my background as PT, and advocacy roots both. So, all right. So disclaimer, information is educational, it is not legal advice. It is not legal interpretation. If you need legal advice and legal interpretation, please consult an attorney. I have to say this over and over again. And as an advocate, I highly encourage that you have a disclaimer like this, because you will be bitten in the butt for practicing outside your scope, which I absolutely understand that. So that has been recommended by me and Michelle are part of it. And I think one other person too, who else is part of COPA? I remember us talking about that. Yeah, okay, thank you. COPA. COPA is the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates. It started as mostly parent attorneys getting together nationally, writing amicus briefs for people who are disabled to help turn over Supreme Court cases. They are very influential for the reason that the Supreme Court had a unanimous decision for Pres versus Sturgis school districts. So just know that COPA has some great resources for that. But I tell people, if you're going to do advocacy training, make sure you disclaim and be very specific that is educational and not legal advice to protect yourselves. That makes sense. And if you aren't sure if it's the way you're educating people is right on something legal wise, as educational, just consult your friends that are attorney. It's good to have friends that are attorney and they can give you the way to say it as an advocate versus how they would say it for the law. So, all right. So we're going to answer 3 questions we're discuss first and then get to the history. So what does advocacy look like to you? Oh yeah, let's wait for microphone. So who wants to go first? What does advocacy look like to you? Nobody? Okay, we got one here.
Yes. Mandy from Birmingham, Alabama. I guess confronting and coming out to address the issues of access and rights that for the services that you believe your job needs. But I'm loud.
So, how many of you guys think the word education when you think of advocacy? Good job. And I say when people are like, what do you do as an advocate? And the first thing I say, because I'm not giving legal advice, because I'm not an attorney, I say I educate people. So really the heart of advocacy is educational. All right, what are current issues you are advocating for? I just want to spend like a quick 2 minutes because I'm just curious about what y'all are seeing presently. I'm very aware of what's going on in the deaf community and everything in terms of what we got going on. Most people don't realize, but recently the American Civil Liberties Union filed OCR complaint. It went viral on social media. There was actually a lot of misinformation related to that because people thought it was a lawsuit, but not a complaint. So that's something I did on TikTok and I got a backslash. It's okay. I do advocacy in the trenches, but I like to hear from people, I just want to provide information. I basically wasn't like, you're wrong. It was more like, okay, here's what a OCR complaint is. Here's what the OCR complaint said. Here's where you can find the information. I'll let you guys figure out the pieces yourself. So that is educational in a sense, but what are other current issues that you're really concerned about that you're seeing? I saw your hand go up first. Nope. Oh, her hand went first, and then we'll get Josh.
Renee,
Okay,
currently piggybacking off your lack of services after the age of 21, you do not get ABA services after the age of 21. Apparently you wake up cured from anything that's ever happened to you ever, and you no longer need PT, OT, speech,
Yeah.
ABA, feeding clinic, nothing. And so that is currently what I am pushing.
Awesome. Josh, what about you?
Josh, so I am me and the agency I work for are trying to push for more accessible housing that is not a part of either apartment complex or a HUD community. It's, if you want to live in a subdivision with everybody else, you should be able to at least have an accessible dwelling of your choice,
Mhm.
and you should be able to be there comfortably.
Yeah.
So, and I don't see much of that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I see a ridiculously upcharge in construction costs, just trying to make your house ADA accessible, even those cookie cutter homes. So go ahead.
I just paid a fortune for the apartment complex that I just moved to have 3 ramps installed that I should not have had to pay for it
No.
to begin with.
No.
So
I believe you. Yep. All right. What about you?
I've got the Michelle. My personal advocacy journey follows my son. As he's aged, I've advocated for things that relate to what he needs. And so I'm in the beginning stages of learning about and advocating for housing for young adults with disabilities, particularly autism, because that's what my son is affected by. Because my son wants to live independently, which he is quite capable of doing. However, there are no supports out there for him. And so my dream would be to have a community. But that's a long way down the road.
Have you met Niles from
Well,
last class? Go ahead. Ooh.
Along those lines of the housing, PIPA graduate 2022 is working on that. She's getting state traction. You will meet her in the coming months. So she's Veronica McGee with Tash, yeah, and Accessible Alabama. So we've got that in the works. We're working on there. You can join forces.
And we need more voices. So that's what's so great about PIPA too, is that this is one, the reason I joined the last cohort, because I'm like, okay, I appreciate everything I'm doing my deaf advocacy journey, but one of the biggest things that I was sharing with some earlier, the deaf culture is trying to move away from using the word deafness under disability, which I understand the reasoning, but I have been trying to educate them. You have to think about the ramifications if you choose to separate yourself. You're gonna end up missing out on those supports. Like, we really have to work all together. So, and that's more the extreme side, I would say, of deaf culture. I like to talk about people, they're somewhere in the middle. Go ahead, Josh.
I got one more. So another pet peeve that our agency has is the idea if you have or need a Medicaid waiver, typically you need to be able to meet the nursing home level of care. And if you don't meet that, then you can't qualify. Well, what if you still need help, but you don't necessarily meet the criteria of living in a nursing home?
These current issues, and I know you guys will talk a little bit about this later, legislators and stuff, but I want you to start like spinning the wheel and stuff, because you have each other to help each other. And I guarantee all of you have a connection that the other person has been looking for. And that's something that's really great about the PIPA network. And Linda's shaking her head, yes. But I want you to think about, just because we're keep moving forward, but I want you to think about, okay, these important issues, whom are you advocating to? Like, think about it in a tier. You have who you have to talk to directly, but who is above that level? And then who's above the next level? How are you to actually mobilize? It's grassroots advocacy. How do you mobilize? You have to figure out your connections and start working your way up. We joke in our stakeholder group. So I'm executive director of Kanji. I'm good friends with the president of Alabama Hands and Voices. She is a bit more of a peaceful advocate than I am. She opens the door, I drive the truck through. So, but we appreciate each other and we do tango in a good way. I understand her sweeter, like attract honey. I get it. And sometimes it doesn't always work, but anyways, so this is just, y'all have this PowerPoint. These are a couple newer books of my favorite disability advocates and different stuff. I highly recommend Being Human. I'm devastated that we lost Judy last year, but she was a phenomenal, and we'll hit on her later, but she really was truly the mother of the disability advocacy. This is a new book, and I've really enjoyed reading this based on research and stuff. It's called Unmasking Autism, the Power of Emerging on Hidden Neurodiversity. So they're trying to pivot from autism just as a label to more of the neurodiversity of the spectrum. It's a good one right now. And then disability pride is what I'm really enjoying. So for disclaimer today, when I focus on the self-advocacy movement, I'm going to really stop right when ADA is signed, because what I started to find as I was researching everything, they consider us still in the self-advocacy movement, but I have begun to argue that we are now in the post-ADA generation of the self-advocacy movement, because you now have children who were born when ADA was signed, there are now the advocates as well. And that's where we are. So we're working a little different. We see more disability representation, but there's more joining hands where I would say it's very 50-50 parents and advocates now that are disabled themselves. You know what I mean? So I like to argue that really the era we're in is post-ADA advocates. And I actually used that term with our superintendent recently in advocating for a child whose child has autism. And she never had really thought before. I was like, wow, she's like, it's weird for me. You're like one of the first people I'm seeing IEP meetings with a disability at the same IEP of the same disability. And she's like, but why? Why do you feel the need to do this? And I'm like, because living experiences do matter. And two, I'm here to help support you and figure out with the school. We know technology has advanced on certain things, but the reality is I'm the post-ADA generation. And when I say like that, I could just kind of see the light bulb go off a little bit in terms of stuff. So it was interesting to me. So these are some books I recommend. This is not an exhaustive list because there's a lot of other great books. All right. What? I don't think it's on.
Some of the books may be given to you at graduation. So don't just go buy them all.
And buy the rest. All right. So before we get into self-advocacy movement, we really need to talk about first, what does self-advocacy mean? All of us have our own lived experiences and journeys, but the reason I want to address this as part of our presentation, I do want to focus on history, but I feel like you can't understand self-advocacy without understanding the theories behind self-advocacy. So this was fascinating to me, and I have to pull my computer back up for the reference. But when you look at the definitions of advocacy, what I typically find often when I'm reading research and psychology, people mix up self-advocacy with self-determination. And to me, they are very different. So I put the definitions up here because I felt like it summarized it well. So when we're thinking about self-advocacy is founded on a foundational belief that all people have the right to make life decisions without undue influence or control by others. So the ability to be able to advocate for oneself is to be able to stand up for one's rights. So that makes sense on advocacy standpoint. But in order to have self-advocacy, there also is a component of self-determination, which is where I know my parents get tripped up. And it's one of the things I work as a deaf mentor is when do they know to slowly back off so their child can fail a little bit and learn. And I mean, props to y'all. I do not have children, but I respect that's a hard line. So self-determination, what self-determination ultimately means, and it's cool because ID actually references this type of version as well, and a couple other people who talk about advocacy parent programs. A person possesses a combination of skills, knowledge, and beliefs that enable a person to engage in a goal-directed, self-regulated, anonymous behavior. So it really requires a set of interrelated skills that include self-advocacy skills. So in the world of self-determination, self-advocacy is actually under the umbrella of self-determination. And I like to highlight it with this chart. So to create a sense of independence and a sense of autonomy in ourselves, we have to go through this hierarchy eventually. And where do we see self-advocacy fall? Kind of in the middle. And then self-determination again, but I cannot tell you how many times one of the biggest things I work with, the children that I work with as a deaf mentor is I am working a lot in the self-acceptance stage because kids are mean. Society is brutal. And I have kids who are raised, their parents have done everything they can, and they are very self-accepting about who they are as an awesome person. And then they hit puberty years. And I start to see this get a bit distorted. And it's not such a hard, challenging, especially somebody on the flip side. But I work in the space of self-acceptance by self-advocacy, because there's even research that shows the more you advocate for yourself, the more you accept it as well. And I am a big believer of fake it till you make it. And it's not necessarily the best I give to these kids. I'm like, you just have to realize you have to try. And one of the things I teach them, like, you advocating for yourself is taking control, because a lot of these children, they are full of anxious and everything, where they don't feel like they have a sense of control. That makes sense. So I like to frame that sometimes these kids are just looking for a sense of control on something. And part of taking control is a bit of that self-acceptance journey and self-advocacy. So it kind of cycles together, which leads to self-disclosure. So self-disclosure is the power to disclose your disability, because you self-advocate for what you need, but you don't really own people a reason for why you need something. Let's be honest. But everybody always wants a reason why. And then self-determination is just a process that you reach to, I know what I need, I self-accept. So this is something I like to hit on related to self-advocacy. And it's funny because internationally, a couple countries came together in 1980s timeframe, known as the International League of Society for Persons with Mental Handicaps, which became the Inclusion International. And they built this philosophy about what self-advocacy means. And you're gonna see in the green, the things they believe, and these were disabled people that got together internationally. So I thought this was really meaningful. But one of the things that I like about this is the principles of self-advocacy. Empowerment. Support must empower individuals to make their own decisions, which goes back into the idea of self-advocacy, self-determination, because they have to have the ability to know and given the chance to make their own decisions. Equal opportunity, equality to be supported as full members of communities, learning and living together. So desegregation of communities, and I want to highlight this. They mean learning, living together as in moving away from institutions where they're completely segregated outside of it. Like they all live together in a community, but they're not in the community. That makes sense. They believe more, Inclusion International believes more, the community is all with the community as well, not segregated. And then institutions are bad for people, and non-labeling. And this is where we've been seeing a lot of the movement recently, where we shifted from some people for disability identity to people first identity. We're talking about the people first identity movement because that's important. But I do recognize that society, we've kind of moved back to, we've taken more power and autonomy and control over, for example, the deaf community, you could say pretty much drives it, because you'll never hear a person say, I identify as a person with hearing loss. You'll say, I am a deaf person. And we're starting to see that with some other disabilities as well, in terms of that, like I have friends that are neurodivergent, and they go, I'm a neurodivergent person. Or instead of saying, I am a person with neurodivergent. So I've been seeing some of that. And because ultimately the power is in words, and the power lays in the person who chooses to identify themselves. So, all right, and it makes sense. Because when you look at all what they said, it pretty much lines up with this chart again. So, all right. And I'll leave with this thought. You cannot be an effective self-advocate without self-determination. And that's something I stand hard by. And it's something I tell parents, part of self-determination is willing to let your child fail. So hard. And I will remember the fear my mother had when I told her I did not want to have the FM system anymore when I was in 6th grade. But I basically made a bet for her. I looked at my mom, and my mom was like, you knew, you were self-determined, you knew what you wanted. You came to me and you were like, I don't wear the FM system anymore, but here's the deal. If my grades slip, I will wear it again. And my mom was like, all right, bet. So that's what self-determination looks like, for example. Another example my mom likes to use is self-determination. I'll never forget I played soccer growing up. I'll never forget the referee who thought my cochlear implants were hearing aids. And I looked at him, I was in 5th grade. And I looked at the ref and I'm like, sir, these are not hearing aids. And he was like, well, you have to take them off. And I'm like, okay, these are my cochlear implants. They allow me to hear you, hear my whistle. I am protected under the American with Disabilities Act. And if you have a problem with that, you can talk to my mother over there. And that's why my mom sees me just pointing to her, talking to this referee. And she was like, all right, so that's where. Okay, so history of self-advocacy movement. We're going to start back. And of course, we all know this. Self-advocacy is a civil rights movement itself. We're thankful for the civil rights movement because they brought forth where we are today, but it's a civil rights movement itself. And one of the things they highlight on self-advocacy focuses on one's political power and one's right to self-determination. So again, the word self-determination. All right, and it does start back. We mentioned this guy yesterday, so y'all remember the normalization principle. The normalization principle is believed to help fuel a lot of the self-advocacy movement because when you look back at the normalization principle, a lot of the ideas behind the normalization principle of integrating and being a part of society as people first. It started feeling there, even though he had the term for people first. So I want to be able to hit other parts, so I'm not going to read through everything. But basically, his intent was to provide normal experiences to people with developmental disabilities. And what's really great about Dr. Niger, this is a quote by him. To be allowed to be human means to be allowed to fail. And he believed in this because he was teaching his parents, because he started a program in Sweden. And that led to this paper called Towards Independence. So basically what he did in Sweden is he started organizing community activities for people with disabilities, and he had a peer group for them as well. But one of the things he highlighted on is you have to let them make decisions for themselves. If you don't agree with the decision because you're afraid they're going to fail, you have to let them make the decision. So I highlight my favorite quotes in blue. So I'm gonna read it. Last year, the Swedish Parents Association arranged a national conference of young adults active in some of our clubs. This gave them an opportunity to discuss between themselves and bring out their own views on activities and matters which concern them. Leisure and time activities, vocation training, employment and wages of shelter workshops, and vocation questions, sorry. It was probably the first time such a conference has been held, and this is in 1969. This is equivalent to any decent revolt. Some of the retired adults themselves definitely want to play a new role in society to create an image of themselves in their own eyes, in the eyes of their parent, and in the eyes of the general public. This struggle for respect and independence is always the normal way to obtain personal dignity and a sense of liberty and equality from Sweden. So, and he presented this paper to the president's panel in 1969. All right, so between 1968 to 1970 is when some of the first advocacy conferences started. And this is really important for us in history because they started and then Great Britain and Canada caught on it. And by 1973, there was a group of disabled Americans that went to Canada's conference. And they went to Oregon, US. They're from Oregon, US. They went to Canada for one of these conferences. But they were disappointed because the conferences was really dominated by professionals, and Canada has a really complex disability history. I will share that it's very medical model driven, and I know this from other friends of mine in Canada. So the Canadian conference, despite the Sweden one, ended up being more medical professionals who were the speakers and stuff versus the disabled people first. So they came back home and created People First in the US. And we do have a great People First organization in Alabama. She was a PIPA graduate, the first cohort. She's part of our PIPA network. I highly recommend you get to know her as well. Jennifer, is her first name? I can see her name right now. Rucker. Yeah, Rucker. All right. So People First, its grassroots was really after that conference in Canada. So they decided and they got together, created grassroots efforts, and they had their first national conference for disabled people in 1974. And nearly over 600 advocates who had disability themselves traveled. And post-conference, because they were so empowered by the number of people that showed up, they decided to call themselves People First. And this is Valerie Schaff, who gave a speech, and she was talking about the labeling, like shifting from disability first label to People First label. And it was a very powerful clip as well. But basically, the idea of People First, the group felt their disabilities were secondary to their personhood. And this grassroots effort led to a big surge in self-advocacy groups across the nation of people with disabilities themselves. So by 1993, at least 27 state organizations exist, some holding as many as 75 local chapters, and others holding 2 to 3 chapters. All right. Redefining disability. So at this point, there was a shift. People with disabilities were starting to call out ableism more, and they were redefining the disability problem. And what we mean by this is what he was referring with the independent living movement with Daniel, the idea of switching from the medical model, because the medical model viewed disability as a problem, as something that has to be treated, and shifting into redefine the disability model. So we're the model being society states that we must adapt to fit in, but we state that society must change its attitudes and practice to accept us as we are. So redefining that disability problem. And we could talk about disabled people versus people with disabilities. They were the focus at the time was focusing on people first language, which makes sense to me because at this point, nobody was considering how the power of disability first language is powerful, but no one was respecting it that way. So it makes sense to me as an advocate, we had to focus on a people first language for such a long time for people to start listening and taking it seriously. All right, this guy, Jacob's Timbrook, he's originally from Canada, moved to the States, has 3 degrees, but has attorney degree, has done a lot of influential work, but he formed the California Council of the Blind. And the reason that I want to point him out today is he believes so much in saying the word of his organization should be of the blind instead of for the blind. Because a lot of what you were seeing in the medical model, it was saying for, but it did put emphasis on disabled people. So he believed in the power of changing the words to the blind. It put people first for that disability himself. So he was very influential with that work because he believed that people who are blind can establish and direct their own organization because he was blind himself. And this is one of the reasons my nonprofit is called Center for Advancement, because we want to advance, but it says of Next Gen Deaf. All right, this is my friend on Instagram. Her handle is Blindness Latina. She has Usher syndrome. She's one of my dearest friends, and she is a big shaker in terms of disability world today. And she is blind herself, Latina. She travels internationally. She's an international speaker and advocates for work inclusion, disability inclusion both. But I like her because she's done a really great job of educating the workforce on how you talk about disability in today's words. So I just put her stuff up because her point with all her carousel, especially on Instagram platform, is we've shifted from people first language to the person with a disability has the power to decide what language. So things that she coaches on is avoiding euphemisms, which makes sense. Like the word differently abled. I cannot tell you how many times that drives me crazy, to be honest. And handicap, of course, because they're a way to make disability more palatable to non-disabled people. And to be honest, part of advocating as a disabled person is making people uncomfortable. There has to be uncomfortable in order to, because when you get uncomfortable, you get pressured. So anyway, so I wanted to share my friend because she's really great with all of her content as well. So, right, movers and shakers. All right, so we're gonna start really early for a reason. There is a lot of confrontational perspectives about Helen Keller that I recognize. But she did, and it's where you have to go back to history. You have to think about the historical context of Helen Keller. The deaf community currently doesn't like her, but you have to think about the historical context of the time. Even though what she said at the time would not have been more appropriate in today's time, she was still influential as her life as a deaf-blind woman from Scubby, Alabama. She actually did a lot more for women's suffrage than disability rights, to be honest, but because she was advocating and really her biggest contribution to disability rights, she was actually one of the founding members as a woman of the American Civil Liberties Union, which is something that a lot of people don't realize. And because the American Civil Liberties Unit has been very impactful with disability history, especially law and certain things, and civil rights movement both. But I do appreciate, because she did recognize, and this is a quote by her, "A person who is severely impaired never knows his hidden sources of strength until he is treated like a normal human being and encouraged to shape his own life." Because she had the opportunity to be able to shape her own life, and she understood, she had the support stuff. Her family was wealthy, so her family was able to hire her own personal tutor from Perkins School of the Blind. That's what some people don't realize, that Ann Sullivan, her teacher, came all the way from Perkins School of the Blind and was here. So because her family had figured out some family sign, and then Ann Sullivan took a step further to figure out a more universal language for her. So I'd like to acknowledge her, and I understand where there is controversy around her, but I appreciate her as a founding member, as a woman. So, all right. We talked about Ed Roberts earlier. He did a good job really talking about him as he was the father of the independent living movement. But what I want to highlight today is the quote that he spoke a lot when he was presenting. Independent living is a psychological idea, much more than a physical concept. I'm paralyzed from the neck down, but I am completely in control of my life. I make the decision about what I want. And when you begin to believe that, it's very empowering and powerful. And then it becomes, it's almost, well, it catches other people. They say, well, if you can do that, why can't I? So he was very influential, and we're going to hit more because since Daniel did such a great job with talking about Ed Roberts today as one of our disabled activists, he was very much a powerful reason for Section 504 and independent living and ADA too. He collaborated with Judy Heumann, who we're talking. All right, who knows this guy? I love him. I got to, as I was doing the research to prepare for this, I did not realize that Mr. Wayblank marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, Alabama. He was considered a very radical minister at the time, and a lot of white people did not like him because he was considered too radical for pushing and supporting Black people, the civil rights movement. So he marched with Martin Luther King Jr., and through him learning from Martin Luther King Jr., speaking against injustice, everything, he ended up moving all the way to Colorado because he was still a passionate at the time, but he took basically a secondary job working in a nursing home in Colorado. And he got fired from that job because the nursing home, Heritage House, was basically dehumanizing their people they lived at. And slowly through time, he worked with a couple other people to start an independent living center called Atlantis Community in Colorado, which is Denver, Colorado's first independent living center. And he basically got the people out Heritage House who were disabled and gave them an opportunity to actually make their own choices and stuff. And so through his work, he was the co-founder of ADAPT, which is known as American Disabled for Attendant Programs Today, with Mike Arbor. He is able himself, so I try to keep two people who are disabled for this point in history, but he's significant because he helped with Capitol Crawl and the events that led to there. So that's why I want to highlight him and his history, because ADAP recognizes him as a strong disabled activist who's really support a lot of the movement because he was a radical himself. And I love this quote from him, but before we get there, one of the things he was responsible for organizing with Mike is Colorado, Denver, and part of the issues within his independent community was transportation. Lack of accessible transportation at the time going on in America, and it's the reason we're talking about why ADA did not pass right away, was there was a congressman on the House who was working with Greyhound, Memtrack, and other buses trying to keep their buses accessible because they didn't want to spend money to make their buses accessible. But the protests started way back in Denver, Colorado on July 4th and 6th of 1978, where the Gang of 19, it was him and 19 other people in wheelchairs. He just got himself a wheelchair that he was able, and they linked themselves. They handcuffed themselves to buses. And they basically got around the buses out. Now, did Crimp Camp show this yesterday or not? I wonder. But not of it. Okay. So the Gang of 19 is what Denver newspapers call them, that they ganged up on two buses that were inaccessible, and they stayed around those two buses for 24 hours to make a point on the lack of accessible transportation in Denver. And Denver started working on being more accessible, but a lot of what they did in Denver fueled how they mobilized nationally. So this quote from Wade Blank is, so I said, like explained, recalling earlier success in the Black civil rights movement. Let's take 25 wheelchairs and go out and surround a bus and hold it and see what happens. Bam, just like magic, it worked. Total power. The police couldn't move the wheelchairs because they were afraid. The mayor said, don't arrest disabled people, we win. So he literally got his ideas from the freedom riders and everything of the civil rights movement, which fueled his movement, which I thought was really cool in history. So. All right, Mike Arbor, he was a disabled person. He used a wheelchair for his life, but he was also the co-founder of ADAPT. And I have his quote on the next slide because he is still living today with us. He is a national leader for ADAPT, civil rights and disabled activist, and he's basically a grassroots organizer. This picture here actually happened before ADA passed. Part of the protest with the buses and transportation on the Freedom. He went to a hotel, and because the hotel was accessible, he locked himself to the revolving doors of his wheelchair to make a point. And they did come to arrest him, and the president knew what was going on and got him out and pardoned him, basically. So he organized the bus gang, the Wheels for Justice in DC, and the Capitol Crawl with other key leaders. So that is his movement and his influence on this. So we're gonna get to him, but this is Mike Arbor. All right, this is a quote. What's significant about this quote, this is the speech he was actually giving on the Capitol steps. That was the signal to start crawling. Yeah, and I just love it. All right, so I'm Maria. Among us are those who are forced to live in institutions against their will. There are those among us who have had our children taken away solely because we are disabled. We have been denied housing and jobs. These iniquities and these injustices must not go on. We will not permit these steps to continue to be a barrier to prevent us from the equality that is rightly ours. The preamble of the Constitution does not say we, the able-bodied people. It says we, the people. And that was the single. So, all right. And this is Mike and then Wade together surrounding a plaque. Denver eventually put a memorial where they did the bus gang of 19. So that's this picture. And this was some of their propaganda they used for the Freedom Riders and stuff, because they were trying to flush out the disabled people. So they used the toilet bowl analogy, which I thought was pretty clever. All right, Bob Caff. He's still with us today. He's also a huge leader and international national organizer for ADAPT as well, especially in 1984. That should be a line down. He was arrested 30 times. That's the point there. He was arrested 30 times for fighting for human and civil rights, both for people with disabilities. He was influential after the ADA because there was a lot of issues going on in the nursing home industry, and he was a big mobilizer and community organizer and fighting to people to not be institutionalized. Even though the institutional era was over, we still know institutionalization happens today. And he was a very dominant voice for that as well. He also helped organize the Capitol Crawl. He specifically got them in. We'll get to the Capitol Crawl, what actually happened post-Capitol Crawl that actually helped ADA to sign further. All right, King Jordan. And I think his first name was Irene. Yes, but we always know him, the deaf community, as King Jordan. He is the first deaf president of GALDAT. So his contribution to the disability community is he helped with some of the writing related to communication under IDA and advocated for the deaf people to be part of the Americans with Disabilities Act, basically. He became a deaf president after a massive protest at GALDAT because at this point, the board was actually all hearing people. And they were trying to appoint another hearing president. And it's GALDAT University, which is all deaf people. So in the because he was the first deaf president established since the institution was established in 1860. So this was around 1950s, no, 1960s, when the 1970s, when this protest happened. And he became the deaf president, but he had a lot of connections, so he was able to help push the ADA a bit more. But he did speak at the Capitol Crawl to Congress as a deaf advocate as well. He also lobbied, and his significant work was actually the next law that passed after American Disabilities Act passed, which was a television decoder circuit act, which is the reason we have closed captioning. So that was a contribution. Yeah, and Linda's like, yes. So that is his big contribution with all this. All right, Judy Human, my favorite person, mother of the disabilities right movement. I highly recommend reading her memoir. It's awesome. And there's also like a nonfiction story written about her as well that she approved. Those are really great reads and stuff. But of course, we know that her work was very instrumental and paved the way for the American Disabilities Act to be created and passed. Like, her achievements cannot be listed. So I highly encourage that you read about her and learn about her because, like Daniel said, she also worked independent living movement with Ed Roberts, but I'm going to highlight more of the Section 504 because what people don't realize, she was 20 and she was a leader in organizing. So I like to point to her as a historical figure, like you're never too young to mobilize and to organize both. So, and this is a quote by her: disability only becomes a tragedy when society fails to provide the things that we need to lead our lives. Yeah. And in her memoir, she talks a lot. Her doctors actually encouraged her parents to abandon her to an orphanage and for her to die. And her parents were like, no, we're gonna figure out how this child, and they were able to keep her out of the institutions. And they basically figured out how to do community living within their home. and they did what they took, like they fought for it. So she acknowledges and thanks for her parents a lot. And her parents were all excellent in her self-advocacy and self-determination journey, both. So, all right, Kitty Come. Do we know who this is? Did y'all cover her last night? Okay, you say again? I didn't hear you. What's it?
Oh, we saw her in the movie.
You saw in the movie? Okay. So typically find a lot of people focus on Ed Roberts and Judy Heumann for Section 504 power, but you can't forget Kitty Cone. Kitty Cone was one of the most influential leaders, and she basically took good care of the San Francisco crowd as well. And she was pretty much their dominant speaker for the power of 504. And she ended up continuing to be on the DREDF, which is basically the Defense Civil Disability Rights Equal Defense Fund. Yeah, thank you. Which is a big disability civil rights organization. She also was a big advocate for LGBTA rights as well after disability rights and different stuff. So she helped with some of that as well. She organized Section 504 with Judy, and she was actually a disabled woman herself. She tried to adopt a child and the state tried to deny her of it. So she's one of the reasons that people with disabilities can adopt children. And she fought for that right, and her case won. So that's some of her contribution as a parent. She started the parent movement of people who are disabled can be parents too. That was her protection as well. So this is a quote by her. And this is related to the importance of why the regulations of Section 504 need to be signed. The signing of the regulations signified the public birth of the disability rights movement. It ushered in an era of disability activism, empowerment, and legislative victories based on the legal concepts of non-discrimination and integration embodied in Section 504, which I absolutely agree with that. When you look at disability history, like I said, there's a lot of threads that leap through, but Section 504 really did push a lot of things because we got the ADA finally signed by 1990, but Section 504 sit-in happened in 1978. So, all right, Brad Lomax, one of my favorite activists too. He is responsible for organizing San Francisco and other cities. So I don't know if Crimp Camp cover, did y'all learn in Crimp Camp, the movie, when they were talking about 504, how many cities were actually sit-in? Like San Francisco was not the only city. Okay, we're gonna cover that. I'll give you the list of cities, but what people don't realize, Section 504 sit-in was actually a national movement. They all coordinated and they all showed up to major cities to where the Department of Health, HUE, headquarters were, and they sat in them. San Francisco is just memorable because it was the longest sit-in. Austin, Texas made it all the way to day 5 before getting kicked out, and New York, Boston were a part of it too. So, and DC was also doing it, but they already got kind of kicked out of the building, but they were still protesting outside the Capitol. But because Brian Lomax was the founder of the DC chapter of the Black Panthers with his brother Glenn Lomax, the Black Panthers, when they realized he needed to get to DC, they actually helped them get the plane in a truck with another disability group there or activist group there and helped get them all the way across the country so they could finish the protest. And this was towards the end of the Section 504 sit-in. And he was able to basically march on Capitol Hill and get it signed with the back of the Black Panther stuff. He also was responsible for integrating and getting the Black Panthers of San Francisco to bring food, medicine, help with personal care and everything while they were in the federal building and stuff as peer supports. So that is his influential impact with Section 504 overall. So I'm one of those big believers. You cannot acknowledge the power of Section 504 without acknowledging the power of the Black Panthers. So, all right, because he got to DC and he was able to force, or not force, but he was able to advocate and put the pressure on DC with the support of everybody else staying in San Francisco to keep the pressure on the center of San Francisco to get it signed, all the regulations signed on April 28th of 1977. All right, I want to highlight Bob Williams just because he's an influential disabled advocate, but he really joined the ACL, which is the Independent Living, as Deputy Commissioner, Administration on Disabilities and Director, Independent Living Administration. I really wanted to highlight him because I like his quotes a lot because he was influential in several of the acts that passed post-independent living, a couple of ones that Daniel hit, but I know there was a picture with him. So his contribution was ensuring, especially some of the Medicaid stuff and the ability to actually have access to funding for independent living. So his quote is the right to community. I want to be clear, I did not say the community. I said the right to community, to be a part of and not apart from life. Because a lot of the things that they were dealing with still was the idea independent living was still very segregated. But the reality of independent community living is supposed to be with the community, not separate of a community within a community. Does that make sense? So, all right, Tony Hulo, I have a hard time with his name. I was just gonna say Tony. So Tony did work with Congressman Major Owens, but he was considered to be the primary sponsor of the Americans with Disabilities Act in the House of Representatives. Congressman Major Owens was also very influential as well, but we still are in a time where the white man's voice was more powerful than the black man's voice, but they worked a lot together as a team. And so he was considered to be the primary sponsor as well, because he was diagnosed with epilepsy as a child. And he actually originally wanted to be a minister and priest, but due to what was known as Kenyan law, he was not allowed to be a priest, because when they did his health assessment to see if he could be a priest or not, they realized he had epilepsy. And he knew he had as a kid, but then they ended up disclosing and told the state that he had epilepsy, so he lost his driver's license and healthcare insurance, both. And so that was his movement as disabled activist. He eventually like turned and decided he'd become in Congress and stuff and try to fight for, you know, people with epilepsy need to have a right to healthcare and everything as well. So he was a big proponent in the House for disability rights, just in general, just because he had lived the experiences of it. And he did work under Biden. So he worked for a very long time post outside Congress. So, all right, Justin Darn, aka when we were referring to the guy in the cowboy hat, he cracks me up a little bit. He is known as the Godfather ADA. He also organized the first group to protest the racism and segregation that Houston University was trying to do in the 1960s as well, because it was back when people were trying to segregate universities, still especially in Texas. He organized and helped lead the protest against the university. And he was actually a Democrat first, and then he switched parties later because he felt like the Democrat Party at the time in history was not actually listening to the needs of disabled people. But he switched parties after his friend Rob Reagan tried to weaken 504, which I thought was kind of interesting. So he opposed his friend Rob Reagan when Reagan had attempted to weaken the disability rights. He basically was trying to weaken the protections related to employment and stuff in 504 when he was administration. And thankfully it did go through. A lot of people rallied and we kept our amendments and stuff, but this was before the regulations and everything as well. All right. And he worked closely with Congress Major Owens of New York to pass ADA as well, along with Tony. All right. So we're talking about the sin. Okay. It's okay. Any questions? Any questions? Oh yeah, we need a microphone. I'm sorry. I have it.
Is ADA synonymous with the 504?
It's a misconception. I get it. Because a lot of those acts all got passed at the same time. 504 is the Rehab Act. So you're gonna find 504 under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. America with Disabilities Act, ADA, is its complete own act. And it was passed in 1990. Yeah. But she put something, 504 was re-amended in 1988. And then civil rights was re-amended in 1988 as well. And that's when people with disabilities had the right to transportation, living, and other stuff. Because remember, when civil rights acts passed in 1964, did I get that right? Yes. When Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, it was related to race and religion more, but it did not include people with disabilities till later. So, all right. I'm sitting down because I'm gonna have my notes because I really want to hit on 504. So what you need to recognize about these movements. All right. Let's see. Okay. So the power of 504. What we refer to 504, this is where you need to think about 504 helped push the ADA, but the focus was on the fact that Section 504 had passed in 1973, but people were not actually abiding by the law because there were no regulations yet. Like it was existing in law, but there wasn't guidelines of how to administrate 504, which refers to the regulations. So that's something that people don't realize, and that's something I'm very careful as an advocate. When you want to sign something in law, you better make sure the regulations are there with the law, which is how most laws are passed today. And that's why we see, when you look at the thing of Bill of Laws, you see papers like this, which I think is terrible, but it's because all those amendments are regulations to whatever law has been proposed on Congress floor. And then Congress likes to haggle and tries to put in their little amendments, which are regulations, into a law, if you get me. So I love Schoolhouse of Rock, but the Bill of Rights is a great video to watch. I know. All right, so the movement for the power of 504 officially started on April 7th of 1977 across the country. But before we get that, we have to explain what's going on. So this is a symbol for the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, known as HEW. So I'm going to say HEW for short for all of this. So HEW, HEW. This was the leading agency, and their regulations would become the guidelines for all other federal agencies. The Department of Transportation, Health, etc., Education even. It was crucial that the regulations be strong because ultimately 504 would cover every area that received federal financial assistance. Between 1973 to 1977, no regulations were issued. During that period, strong regulations were drafted by attorneys in the Office for Civil Rights, so where your OCR complaints go to, sent to the Secretary HEW with a recommendation to publish them in the proposed form and the Federal Register for public comment. So basically, between when it was passed, there was a lot of conflict with how was Section 504 to be administrative and how was it to be utilized, and that was basically the regulations. So this picture here is Jimmy Carter in the background with HEW's Secretary Joe Calfred Jr. at a press conference. Yes? Thank you. All right, so this is a symbol for HEW, okay? Thank you. This is a symbol for HEW and what it looks like. And then this is the picture of Secretary of HEW at the time, who is Joe Calford, with President Jimmy Carter. So by this point, Reagan was not in office anymore. It was now already transition presidents. We were with Jimmy Carter at this point. So at this time, we talked a little bit about earlier, the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, so the ACCD, realized that these regulations were being ignored by the Secretary of HEW and everything. And they realized that they were also trying to change the regulations behind disabled people's back without input from disabled people, how Section 504 should be utilized and implemented. So that led to, once Carter was in office, instead of signing the regulations, HEW set up a task force with no representation from the deaf or from the disabled community to study them. They wanted to study disabled people ultimately and figure out if they really need the regulations or not. That's kind of the summary. So they were intentionally delaying through politics and everything, trying to not sign these regulations. So that led to the ACC started mobilizing together. So a bunch of names I mentioned earlier, some influential names, Judy Heumann, Ed Roberts, Bob Catholic. But at this point, Wade Blank was not on the scene, but he was aware of it. But Bob Caff was there, and Justin Dart was there as well, and all that. And it's they started to realize that they needed to address this sooner than later because, like I said, there was a task force set up trying to shape what the regulations should be without any voices from the disability community. So it ultimately led to organizing. So, like I said, like y'all saw at Crip Camp, this is from San Francisco. But what people don't realize that this was the most organized movement nationally in some of this history of disability rights, because other cities that also organized and decided to occupy the building. So basically what the disability committee, the leaders got together and they told the federal HEW, okay, if you don't sign these regulations, we're going to sit in your federal buildings where the HEW is of each city. And they thought, they were like, thinking, oh, these people are disabled. They're not, they can't do this. Like, we're not going to take them serious. Like, there's no way they're going to sit in. Like, they don't have the ability to sit in. Fuel to the fire, if I may say. So what people don't realize, but I think the reason of the power of 504, because it was the longest sit-in of all sit-ins, as the people of San Francisco sat for 26 days. They started on April 5th is when the sit-ins start. So they basically gave the warning April 3rd, 4th, and basically gave them 24 hours. Like, you do this or we do this. And they occupied the buildings in Boston, Seattle, New York, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Chicago. So I said Austin earlier, it was Dallas, Texas, Denver, and Washington, D.C. And like I said, Dallas actually made it a little longer. New York made it decently long. I have to go back and look, but people remember San Francisco the most because they made it to 26 days and a lot of the documentary. And I think the reason, because one of the things that people don't realize about the sit-in, they knew each other, the other cities were doing the sit-ins, but it didn't make news because the news camera did not show up at San Francisco till like 5 to 6 days later. I'm gonna give 2 more minutes and then we're gonna roll back in. Where we want to go? Okay, let's see. Yeah, we have about 10 minutes. Okay, we're gonna keep going. All right, so. And this will give a good opportunity because these are not official names of movements. I just like to put words on things to help people remember. Sometimes when you label specific movements, people don't remember them. This movement itself didn't have an exact name, but really, I consider this bus lockdown to be the first. This is actually the gangs of 16. So I was talking about Wade Blank earlier and Mike Harper in Denver, Colorado. This is where we're going now. All right, so here you go. This is them putting their wheelchairs around to buses that were inaccessible. And so this is one picture here. And I really love the design that one people had here. And the sign says taxation without transportation, because they were basically paying taxes for transportation. That didn't work. And what they did is not clear in this picture, but you could kind of see it slightly right here. He's handcuffed himself to his wheelchair, and some would actually handcuff their wheelchairs between themselves. So that way they were able to surround the buses, but the buses couldn't move because they were all handcuffed to each other. So this is the other picture for it. So these are people walking, and he has handcuffed himself to like the front of the bus, because you like the front of the bus, so you have like that little bar. That's where they're handcuffed to themselves to the wheelchair. So this is really important because this is where the ADAPT, that movement we talked about, the ADAPT. ADAPT members are blocking a bus right now here to demonstrate the lack of accessible transportation. And this is February 15th of 1985 in this picture. But it's really important to recognize because this is a lot of the fuel. So like we said, Section 504 and everything, the sit-in was 1978. And for a while, there was still a lot of organizing and stuff, not as necessarily big movements, but one of the big issues they were having was, this is around the time that the US was trying to make more transportation happening, but it was basically monopolies of huge companies that were buying out small companies across the whole nation. So Amtrak, Greyhounds, and I'll name a couple other bus cement. But one of the things that I want to highlight, ADAP, part of all of this, they got Denver fixed. And then Atlanta is where Amtrak and Greyhound's headquarters were. They actually flew themselves to Atlanta, Georgia on September of 1988. So think about dates here. 1988, American with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990. So this is kind of the beginning of some of the movement. ADAP flew all the way to Atlanta, Georgia, because public and private bus operators were trying to load up on cheap, inaccessible buses, because they knew it was coming, that they'd be forced to buy buses that were accessible, and they were considering those too costly. So they were trying to buy as many inaccessible buses they could to save their money before ADA passed, just to say they got grandfathered in. So they flew themselves to Atlanta, and they went to the federal building in downtown Atlanta overnight, where they received a clear signal that the White House was on their side, because Atlanta, Georgia was still going through a lot. We know the history of civil rights, especially across the South, is very vicious, and was for a while and everything. But they were being arrested as they were occupying the federal building to protest the companies and private payers trying to buy these inaccessible buses. And President George W. Bush himself called Atlanta and told them they need to be escorted back inside. So that picture you saw of Mike himself basically chained to the door, that was Atlanta. So, and then the next day, officials from the U.S. Department of Transportation arrived by helicopter to start negotiating a temporary agreement on the inaccessible bus purchase in Atlanta. So that's how they kind of stalled the movement related to inaccessible buses on Adapt. All right, which led to Wheels of Justice, which was inspired by the Freedom Riders. All right. So this is our version of the Freedom Riders and the disability. It was inspired, like I said, by the Freedom Riders. So at this point, and this is where history and context really matter. This is now in 1990. We're moving into their American with Disabilities Act have been written. People were co-sponsoring everything. It had passed through the Senate with absolutely no problem. But it was sitting on the House of Floors and stalling because. So what people don't realize is, let me back up a little bit. Okay, so the wording they like to use when they talk about history is 88 was bottled up in the House of Committee on Public Works and Transportation. ADAPT was lobbying against Amtrak, Greyhound, the American Bus Association, the APTA, which was the American Public Transportation Association, because Bud Schuster, who was a Republican from Pennsylvania, authored what they called a poison bill amendment, exempting rural areas from making bus accessible to protect the companies. Because the companies have failed to buy as many inaccessible buses as they could for the big cities, but the rural areas did not have accessible bus. And we all know that rural transportation is still a massive issue even to this day today. But Representative Bud Schuster was trying to stale the bill and try to keep this amendment in. And he was not willing to sign or let the bill be introduced to the floor unless his poison amendment got in, which was basically a loophole for the big bus companies to keep their money. So ADAPT at that point decided to go to Washington, D.C., meet with the House leaders, including Schuster, to persuade them to vote ADA out of the community and bring it to the floor. So Schuster was holding ADA on the committee, and that's what people don't realize. ADA was not under other committees; it was under the community of Public Works and Transportation. That's where it moved forward from to get onto the floor at that point. So the ADAPT leaders, they came to Washington, D.C. on Sunday, March 11th of 1990. And there was a total of about 200 activists that were sharing a hotel room and everything with only 3 wheelchair accessible guest room bathrooms. The following day, about 475 people, many in wheelchairs, gathered on the sidewalk in front of the White House to launch what they call Wheels on Justice campaign. They marched down Pennsylvania Avenue where they joined another 250 people at the bottom of the marble steps leading up to the west front of the Capitol building. So they call themselves Wheels Justice because they mainly pushed themselves that many blocks over to protest all the way in front of the Capitol. So, and I know like from history, it was also Wheel Justice because a bunch of them were jumping on buses to prove how inaccessible they were. They had people helping them get onto these buses to get themselves to DC as well, to get to this point as well. So the Wheels of Justice is a combination of them mainly moving themselves through DC while also pointing out the buses too. All right. So here's another example. All right. So what was really important, this is Bob Capper, if you want to know, leading the march on the front, and a person I did not mention, but is a big civil rights activist, and I meant to put her in my PowerPoint, and I realized it this morning. The one next to her is Stephanie Thomas, is what the picture says, and Stephanie Thomas was a big leader for ADAPT as well as a woman with disabilities as well, and she was one of the mobilizers too. So her name's Stephanie Thomas. I would highly recommend looking her up. But so they got all the way to the Capitol steps and everything, and here Kath introduced several speakers. First was Justin Dart, the new chairman of the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities, who praised the marchers as the pioneer patriots of the 20th century. And then several other speakers follow. Members of Congress, so the people who are endorsing ADA and everything, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission Chair, Evan Kemp, I. Keene Jordan, the deaf president of Gallaudet, and James Bradley, the former White House press secretary who had been shot in the head during the 1981 assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. He survived that assassination, and he became a big disabled activist because he was an able person, became a disabled person, and realized the importance that what he needed for disability rights post-assassination. It was there as they were presenting. And like I said, we talked about Mike Arbor's speech. He was the signal for them to start crawling on the steps. So Here are the pictures of the famous crawl. Here's Justin Dart on your right, giving his speech on his part, and everybody's waiting as praying, and then they start crawling their steps. Mike even made a comment with all this that he was one of the ones that crawled up the steps, and but the thing that was fascinating about the steps, you had different people, different bodies, different stuff. So some people were fast, some people were short, and Mike said it took him 45 minutes to go up all 78 steps, which is pretty fascinating. And that's why it got wired, because by this point, Capitol Hill is looking like this is a bad look to see people crawling up our steps. And we're trying to get people to stop and stuff. So most of the news remember the steps, and people remember the news distinctively because in this whole crowd, it just wasn't adults that were organizing, but there was a parent and their 8-year-old daughter requested. Her name is Jennifer. Can't remember the last name. Jennifer was an 8-year-old wheelchair user who climbed up the Capitol steps as well. So she went viral on the media too as a child crawling up 78 steps on the Capitol building. So, and then the quote, like I said, the signal for them to start crawling is when his speech concluded, which was when he said, the preamble of the Constitution does not say we, the able-bodied people. It says we, the people. That was the agree cue that ADAP had all decided among themselves that they were going to get out of their wheelchairs and start crawling to make their point. So, all right. Okay, but there's more. Oh, did I lose it? Okay. All right. This is an interesting picture because like I said, I don't know how far the movie got, but what people don't realize is Capitol Crawl was important, but the next 2 days were important after that. So this picture here is the next day on Tuesday, 200 disabled activists led by Koff, Bob, Thomas, Mike, Blank, and Johnson showed up in the Capitol Rondon for a scheduled tour of the building. So they had this planned months in advance, and they scheduled a tour for all the disabled people to see the Capitol Rondon. They had this planned in. And I don't think Washington had really thought and realized that these same people had scheduled a tour were the same people that had just crawled up the Capitol steps. But you have to admit, that's pretty smart, very well planning. Because as they scheduled, but once they got inside, they changed their wheelchairs together. So that way they could be stuck inside, and they demanded to speak to the House Republican leader at the time, who was Bob Mitchell of Illinois, and Speaker Tom Foley, who was Democrat of Washington. And other legislators that were there were Steiny Hugh, which is let's see, that's Montana. And then some of these guys did speak with protesters for like, so this picture is here, them all sitting, they are chained together, protesting within the Capitol building. So Foley and Mitchell spoke a lot about prompt passage of ADA, but would make no commitment. So the activists refused to disperse, and the Capitol Police began arresting and taking them away one by one in the building's tiny elevator. Because remember, at this time, the elevators were not accessible, so they mobilized enough and got themselves inside. That's why they chained themselves together, because you literally had to take them one by one to get them out. And it took more than 6 hours to get them all out of the building. So dedication. All right. This next photo is the next day. So in this photo is Wednesday. So Capitol Crawl happened on Monday. Them trying to take over the Capitol's runtime took place on Tuesday, lasted 6 hours. So they got arrested to get out of there on Wednesday after the failed attempt to disrupt service on the Capitol train. And so while they were doing this, people were trying to show that the trains were not accessible either. The activists regrouped and took over the office of Schuster, the same Republican who was trying to keep it in the committee. They took over his office and they chained himself to his desk. So Schuster, who authored the amendment weakening the ADA's transportation provisions. So 60 former activists were arrested, and then on Thursday and Friday were in court. And because they were disabled, and this is the activists that had to be forced and told to go to court because they got arrested again. Arbor was slapped with a $500 fine and placed on 1-year probation, where he and Thomas and 3 others reported to the federally funded probation office on Friday. They found that there was no ramp to allow them into the building. So again, why the ADA exists. So they did what they were supposed to do as citizens. They got arrested. They're like, we come here to report and we can't get into the building. And what happened, and I thought was interesting, they said marble steps were provided for those without disabilities, but the wooden ramp had rotted away and not been replaced. So their lawyer basically fought to get them registered for a year of probation, like outside of it, because they can't even get in the building to do their probation post-arrest. And then, all of that, the national press and everything, and Schuster basically lost over all of this. His amendment was a monster, but rejected in the House. The bill went to the Congress, where one of the last restrictive amendments, which was known as the infamous Chaplin Amendment, allowing employers to remove persons with so the Chaplin Amendment, there was an amendment that was also being protested. The main point of all this was related to more transportation and trying to get into buildings. But once it got Schuster out, the people that were on the floor got the Chapman Amendment removed. And that amendment was specifically, people are trying to amend that to allow employers the opportunity to remove persons with contagious diseases, AIDS, from food handling positions. And this was excised after a very heated debate, because this is also around, in terms of history, the AIDS pandemic. And a lot of people were treating people who had AIDS as equivalent, I would say, of people with leprosy back in the day. It was very harmful, especially to Black people and the LGBTA community. But that was one of the amendments that some of the people, especially the Republican Party, were trying to slide in with all this to get people who had contracted AIDS to not have an opportunity to jobs and stuff. So, all right. But thankfully, the bill passed and was signed by law by George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, which is this picture here. So, but people, I feel like when you look back and watch history, some people kind of briefly mentioned the Capitol crawl. And I thought it was so fascinating as a disabled activist and advocate to learn more beyond the current camp, because I didn't even realize how much they were holding Washington, D.C. up afterwards. And it was a whole week of protesting. It wasn't just like, oh, ADA got signed. I feel like that's how it is. Like Capitol crawl happened and ADA got signed. There was a lot more organizing. So we have to think, adapt for that as well. So, all right. All right. And I love this quote, because really, truly, when you look at the beauty of ADA and what was going on with all the protesting, nothing about us without us all. Questions? Because that's all I have. So I'm willing to answer questions and use the last time, because I realized we may talk about ID a little bit. I have about 30 minutes, so I don't have anything creative, but if you've got questions related to things you find confusing as an advocate, I'm happy to answer them. So I'll give you all a couple minutes, but I really want to highlight the history of significant civil rights disabled movements, because it led to the meaningful passage. You can continue to do, like you referenced the first presentation I did yesterday, you'll see some of the amendments that are very important, but just realize that a lot of what we just talked about is what fueled and continued the work for those amendments as well. Now, what you gotta realize about ID, so ID, the Special Education of All Handicapped Children Act, that was passed and renamed in 1990 as well. And there wasn't as much protesting with that. It came more after the heart of a lot of the cases that happened. So Rowley was the first case where schools don't really have to accommodate and give the best supports. And then there was Edwin F., which is the Cadillac versus the Chevy. And ID really got driven by Edwin F., I would say. And what's really important to know, when ID passed in 1990 is when transition services were included and Part B and Part C were established. And it was a couple amendments later, especially the reauthorization of 2004, they gave the rights to parents. And that's something that I'd like to highlight. People don't realize that the original ID law did not give parents the right to consent on a lot of things, and the parents didn't have procedural rights until 2004. And further procedural rights and due process till 2014. ID has not been reauthorized since 2014. Yes.
It is long overdue time for reauthorization of idea.
So which one? First question?
Idea.
ID. I don't have it on PowerPoint. I apologize. I was talking about it just because I have extra time, and I realized based on this morning. But I'll be happy to give you all some links and stuff afterwards and write up a few slides. So you just have a couple of those references to find easily. So yeah, does that work? But I apologize. That's on me. I will admit and be honest that the history of disabilities took so long to create that I created the self-advocacy movement in 24 hours. I knew a lot about it, but I will just claim and say that's my fault. I hired a new employee this past month, so I'm a one-woman show, now a two-woman show. As I mentioned, I'm HR and everything, so it's just part of nonprofit work. My job comes first. I report to my board of directors, and this I'm very thankful for. So thank you, Pippa and the team, all of you guys for allowing me to be a part of this because I really enjoy getting to meet people who want to do grassroots effort and mobilize because that really is significant. Now, I was talking about Michelle earlier. One of the biggest books that I actually like to read as an advocate is The Rules of the Radical by Saul Polsky, who's very influential. But what people don't realize that the rule of radicals still apply today because they talk a lot about mobilizing and the power of media to mobilize. And that's something we talk about again and again with COPA as well, is the power of using media as an exhaustive measure. So that's where I'll give you an example. Last month, I threatened the Alabama Department of Special Education. I threatened the Alabama State Department of Education based on they had formed a committee to talk about deaf education that did not have deaf representation. And I did a letter first, but I had a plan. I had worked with a couple other people, but I had a plan that if my letter was not received, and I emailed it to all people who were on that committee, plus stakeholders that were excluded from that committee. And I advocated that you need to include deaf representation of adults across all deafness range. And that makes sense. I care about who was on it. It was just more, there was no adults. And two, the Alabama State Department of Education was trying to put one deaf adult who she has excellent lived experiences, but they were trying to get a all per size fit one person on the committee. And that was just the issue I had. And they were also excluding people from this committee as well. But they received my letter well, but I actually ended up having to go all the way behind their backs to Dr. Graham Sisson, who is the executive director of Good. And because apparently my letter did not get through the Alabama Department of Education's emails on certain things. So thankfully, because I knew people and knew what I needed to do to mobilize, and it's not a bad idea to ask for help, but I think that's the point I'm trying to make here. But it's nice to know who your allies are. Because I just basically asked Dr. Graham Sisson straight up, I'm like, all right, where can I file for a discrimination complaint against the department? And he kind of said, you kind of can, you kind of can't. So I'd say follow the money, but he was helpful and he ended up getting to the head person and basically passed my letter along. So it helped out, but I actually had a plan. One of the things I told in my letter is like, if I don't hear a response from you at this point, I'm emailing your superintendent next. And I had a whole other letter draft up. If I don't hear a response from you from this date, I'm going to the media and I already have an investigative reporter that I'm good friends with on equality and stuff. So that's what mobilizing looks like, but it comes from the rules of being radical as well. You don't have to be extremists like that, I'm just saying, but it's good to know what your tools are. And what I typically find in special education and advocating for IEP stuff, if the school tells you you can't get documents and stuff, file a FOAI requests. Do we know what that stands for? Freedom of Information Act. It may take a while, but once it's time in the system, it doesn't look good on school districts at that point. It's the same reason filing a state complaint, but I will dissuade, not against state complaints. It's just state complaints are tricky because if you file a state complaint as a family member, it can impact you with your due process. So I tell families to consider if you're trying to file a complaint against the school district, each look at more OCR complaints, but sometimes it's better to have a systematic complaint there, but you have to actually have documentation that there is discrimination happening versus state complaint is more about procedural process. So, and that's just all things that you learn as an advocate in the game, depending on your goal. Like if you want to advocate for other people and help them in the trenches versus advocating just for your child. But I tell number one thing, you better know your procedural rights. So, and if you don't know your procedural rights are, I actually do have a free PDF on our website that you can log on, give your email procedural rights, but let me fix the link because I've been having some issues. The design team I've been working with outsourcing, they only put one page of my PDF. So if you want it sooner, just shoot me an email. I'll give you our PDF, but it just gives you a list of what procedural rights are under ID law for parents and stuff, what are your safeguards, which are just good to know. And it's information you can find anywhere, but I find people are just so spread out, they have a hard time finding where, but it's good things to know. But one of the things that people forget as parents, it's actually protected in ID law that you have the right to bring an advocate to the table. That's actually protected under your rights. So that is one of my biggest advocacy tools and something I like to highlight to let people know. So do you have a question?
Hey, it's Ashley. Sorry, I had to make sure it was on. Can you explain, because I have a horrible time explaining this, how federal law just because something is passed federally does not mean it's automatically done by the state because it has to be adopted.
So let's use ID as an example. How about that? So federal law has the floor, all right? So the federal law is the floor of your houses. Interstate law are the walls. So in some states, your houses look like shacks. In other states, your houses look like mansions. They're supposed to refer to the federal law as the guidance of all, but really your federal law is the floor. And the state has to go back to the federal law at some point. If federal dictates it, the state has to have it within their laws, but to how powerfully implemented it is. So I like to use that analogy, like when you look at IEPs and ID, like state to state, I like to use the federal law is the floor of your house because the states all recognize the federal law, but then the rest of your structure is going to depend on the state code, which in Alabama, our state law is known as state Alabama code. If you want to know Alabama code. So that's how it all looks different. So that's where it's, I would say, now it's educational, creative wording can really strengthen or really weaken what federal implies. Does that answer your question? But I like to use the whole idea that when you look at state versus federal law is the floor, and then your state law dictates what type of house you have for protections. So, did that answer your question? Yeah. Anything else? Okay.
Hi, this is Rashonda. Not a question, but I was gonna say that actually relates to a lot of things, not just with, disability, but they affect everything. And I think that's a good, something like we should definitely pass on when it comes down to voting. It's because a lot of times everybody will come out and vote for the president elections, but when it comes down to our cities and our states, especially our community, I'm a big advocate for,
Yeah, let's see. Look at top right. So this one, there's a sign language interpreter interpreting the speeches and stuff. Over here is this example of just some of the makeshift mattresses and they did to keep the sit-in and stuff, to keep themselves in the building, the ones who would not leave and go home. This is how they organized, stayed in. The bond picture is parts of the rally as well prior to sitting in the building. And in this picture, it was told me that this picture is actually Mike Erber is in this picture. So, all right, this sign, there's the next picture. The injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This is the march in DC. So this is basically ultimately what Brad Lomax flew to keep them going because DC group had already been kicked out of the federal building, but they knew they were still going to San Francisco and staying in touch. And then they were trying to pressure the people of Congress and everything to sign the regulations too. And so Brad Lomax flew with some other people to march in DC to help keep pushing as well. So, and this is for the history there. So, because at this point, the East Coast did not know about the sit-in in the West Coast. So they decided to push it further, fly themselves to the East Coast, to DC to keep marching and to make the national news at this point overall, to realize that this was actually going on. And it was written, so Kitty wrote this. All right, let me read this. All right, so after 2 weeks of the sit-in, a contingent was chosen to go to DC to lend the moral authority and leadership of the sit-in to the efforts there to pressure the administration. We really wanted to break open the East Coast press, and we wanted some more demonstrations that would mobilize people, and we were striving to get a meeting with the White House. The Massachusetts Union, so the Massachusetts Union was the other union that was working with the Black Panthers, rented a large U-Haul truck with a lift on the back, and all the demonstrators who were wheelchair riders were transporting that vehicle. They also had a large reception for us at their international headquarters. And after we had eaten, and we were asked to speak, and I believe we all saying, "We shall overcome." The international vice president became very involved with assisting us with anything we needed. They allowed us to use their union headquarters to organize demonstrations. So we had access to telephone lines, copy machines, and all other things necessary for organizing. And so here's DC. So one of the most important things about DC when they got there was they were trying to hold meetings in the Capitol with Senators Alan Cranston and Harrison Williams. Senator Cranston was one of the original sponsors of legislation of the regulations. Up till we had met him, he had been supporting the administration. But But he had been trying to fight on the floor the administration's objections to unchanged 504 regulations because they were trying to change the 504 regulations and weaken them before they signed them. Each objection was answered by a different member of delegation, and he was in charge of getting them on the floor. And for every objection, they had a response to defend the regulation. It was a testament to this group's self-confidence and total understanding of the contested issues that issue by issue, Cranston was turned around in front of national TV cameras and the media. We were all extremely tired and sleep deprived by this point, and yet everyone, whoops. You good? Oops. You're good. All right. And then by this point, Frank Bow, who was the director of the American Citizens Coalition Disabilities Act, a deaf man, he spoke last. He made eloquent remarks in which he said, "Senator, we're not even second-class citizens, we're third-class citizens," and thus we all began to cry. An important tack when we got to DC was challenging Carter on having open door administration. Each administration defines itself by a slogan as such as the Great Society. The Carter administration presented itself as accessible to people, and they called it open door administration. So we demonstrated wherever Carter and Calflo went, who was the Secretary of Hugh at this point, forcing them to go out back doors. At Carter's church, when Calflo spoke to the press club, holding virgils and prayers outside California's home was all about getting East Coast coverage. And that was important for us getting a meeting in the White House. The Senate and the conduit it sent to Washington were pivotal in getting the strong Section 504 regulations signed that embody concepts of equity and integration. The affirmative steps that must be taken to achieve for people with disabilities, 504 has never been enforceable as it should be. The Department of Transportation 504 regulations, which call for reasonable phased in measures to make sure that public transportation was accessible, turned into a bitter fight between the American Public Transportation Association and the disability community, and were later overturned in federal court in 1980. Those measures became a part of ADA 10 years later. So this is the important part of history that I want to highlight, that they got the regulations passed and everything. There was still a lot of fight over the transportation piece, and the transportation piece continued to be fuel for the fire for the next movement. But let's take a break for 10 minutes and then come back in because I see a couple people and I'm gonna get some water too. And then we'll keep going. That sound good? All right, let's break for 10 minutes and then come back in.
So it's great to be here with you this morning. And I want to first thank you, Linda, for the invitation to come and be part of this, be part of the PIPA program. I think this is the third time I've joined you, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So it's a great honor and privilege and pleasure really to be back here with you to talk about the history of independent living. And I also want to thank, Daryl for your support. I know that you and the DD Council and you and your team have done a fantastic job. Holly and the rest of your team have done a fantastic job in keeping this movement going. And so I think the DD Council deserves a great deal of credit for that. And Alex, the work that you do, always impressed with the work you do. From the very first time I think we met and had done some work together, I've just been totally impressed with that work. So again, it's great to be here. And I want to just say hello to everybody here and everybody who here's on Zoom. I guess we have several people here on Zoom, so I want to say hello to you. Don't want to leave you guys out. And so what I'd like to do, just to sort of reintroduce myself, my name is Dan Kessler, and I live here in Birmingham, lived in Birmingham for the last, 28 years. So we've been here in the city for the last 28 years. And prior to that, we used to live out in Trussville. So we've actually been here in Alabama since 1989. So probably more than half my life now I've been here in Alabama. And in Jefferson County. So it's and prior to and so when I came here, I started working for an organization called the Birmingham Independent Living Center. Other people call it Independent Living Center, and now it's called Disability Rights and Resources. So that we sort of kept changing over the years. Josh, this was before you came to the center, where the center is now known as Disability Rights and Resources. So I think you probably all have met Josh. So if you're looking for a resource on independent living in the state, Josh would be a really great resource for you. We've, and prior to that, actually, I had worked at a very, very brief period of time, worked at a rehabilitation hospital actually on the banks of the Mississippi River. And we had a great view of the Mississippi from my office, but it was in a hospital setting, worked there for about a year, working with people who had sustained traumatic brain injuries, spinal cord injuries, and other types of disabilities that came in for rehabilitation, then were discharged. And so, but prior to that, I had worked at it was another center for independent living. Actually, it was called they actually had, I got confused for my first year or two there because they kept changing their name. But anyway, they were the New Orleans Center for Independent Living. So they were actually around since about 1980 or so. And so did some work there. That was in the days actually when Centers for Independent Living were operating transitional programs, CILs, that is the term. By the way, if you get a chance, just, if you will, right now, do something for me. If you have your cell phones with you, I generally don't, not a big fan of people using their cell phones when I'm speaking, but I'll make an exception here. So if you will, just Google independent living real quick. And Daryl, I think we're going to need the mic. Okay, so if you raise your hand, somebody want to raise their hand and tell us what's the first couple of things that come up when you just Google independent living? We have
The first, Paula, veteran from Hoover. The first one is an ad for Town Village, Vestavia Hills. So the first few are actual places.
Yeah,
that
can you
you
just
can
read
go-
them? Just read them, yeah.
Right, okay. Independent living near you, compare Vestavia Hills facilities, Brookdale Independent Living, find a community near you, Atlas Senior Living, Brookdale University Park, the Brook. And then you finally get to like drop downs where you can say what is defined as independent living. If you
Right,
want the
okay,
definition of
okay.
it.
So,
One right here.
no, we have one, okay.
Kira, my name is Kira. I have the 10 best independent living communities in Birmingham, 5 independent living communities near Birmingham, and 20 independent living communities.
Okay,
Same stuff. Mandy from Hoover, Birmingham, Alabama. I see Centers for Independent Living, Disability Rights and Resources.
okay.
Atlas Senior Living,
Mhm.
the Brook. And then, of course, the suggested, how long does it take to get used to assisted living, and mostly for seniors, and then suggestions about stuff.
Okay, okay. So yeah, so what came up, I was glad that Disability Rights and Resources came up, that a Center for Independent Living actually came up when you do that search. But this has been one of the problems, I think, that Centers for Independent Living have had, is if somebody's looking, when people are searching for a Center for Independent Living, they just type in independent living, all these residential facilities show up, assisted living facilities show up, other types of independently living units, et cetera. So those are things that come up when people in the general public want to find out more about independent living. So that's not what we're going to be talking about today, okay? So we're not going to be talking about those facilities, okay? We're going to be talking about something very different from that. So anyway, we have up here, Jess, I'd like you to just join in anytime you want, okay? And I want to thank Jess, by the way, I tell you, I think Jess deserves a round of applause for the work that she did. For the work that she did yesterday. And I thought to myself, oh man, Jess is so awesome here, and I've got to come after her. And You didn't make it easy on me, Jess, okay? I gotta tell you.
Good stuff too.
Okay, so anyway, I think, does everybody know who's, does anybody, well, I can describe, I'll describe what we have up here on the screen. We have up here a photo of a gentleman with a breathing apparatus who's using a wheelchair, gentleman with a beard. Josh, you know who this is, but any others know who this? And Jess, you know who this is, but any thoughts about who this individual might be? Okay. When you get a chance, not right now, but when you get a chance, Google Ed Roberts. Okay. And Ed Roberts is the founder of one of the very first centers for independent living in Berkeley, California. And so Ed came, actually, also while you're at it, while you're also Googling, when you get a chance to do that, maybe during a break, but Zona Roberts, Zona, Z-O-N-A, she should come up. But anyway, Zona was Ed's mother. And so Ed Roberts is considered the father of independent living, the founder of one of the first centers for independent living. Although there are probably some others in other parts of the country who may try to lay claim, but actually Ed Roberts was one of the very first ones. And Ed Roberts, and Alex, I don't know if there's any way to do this, but I was going through some of my, in retirement, you have time to do some things that you just never got around to doing. And so I have a stack of old family slides going back to, I won't tell you how far back, but probably into the 60s, but also have some videos. And one of the videos actually is a video of Ed Roberts when he came to Birmingham. He actually came to Birmingham back in the 80s and spoke at, it's now United Ability. I think y'all know United Ability, many of you do, but back then it was called United Cerebral Palsy, or UCP. And so I don't know if there's any way we could get that sort of taken from a VHS tape to more digital current technology. I think that'd be great. I don't know if Alex, if we know anybody who can do that, but if we do, I'd love to talk to you at some point. Yeah. So anyway, but Ed Roberts is considered the father of independent living. And so also one thing you might want to do too to learn more about Ed Roberts, when you do your Google search, Ed Roberts and the Larry King Show. Ed Roberts, some of you may remember Larry King. Larry King had a show for many, many years on CNN, and Ed appeared on CNN. On Larry's show. It was a very good segment. So if you get a chance, take a look at that. And so I do want to talk a little bit more about, sort of the founding, what happened in Berkeley to get that center off the ground. And so what I'd like us to do today, do several things. One is talk about the independent living philosophy and paradigm, and to make that distinction between independent living and, say, the types of programs that you saw on your Google search, and what is independent living and why is it distinct? And also, what have been some of the influences on independent living? None of us operates in a vacuum. There's always been, like when Jess was talking yesterday about the history, disability history, going back 3,500 years. There's a path you can probably follow from the independent living movement back through those ancient times. And so I think it's important to understand, but back in the 60s, there were some other influences. There was a lot of changes in the 60s that were going on. Some of us remember, but there was a lot going on in the 60s where that really had a major influence on the independent living movement. And so we want to look at some of the key events and people. We want to look at some of the key legislation, and also look at independent living today. Where do we stand right now? And I'd sure like to hear from some of you about what your thoughts of what you know about independent living, centers for independent living and what they do, and your thoughts about maybe where centers should be going, if we have time to do that. So I'd first like to, Jess talked yesterday about the medical model. And the medical model is something, there's been a lot written about that, about the independent living model versus the medical model. There's a lot written about that. So you can find a lot of information online. And so probably all of us have been to the doctor before, and we've had the intervention of medical people. But one of the things that I think that was clear, at least in those days, and although, you know, some of this has changed over the years in terms of people these days being much more informed when they go to see the doctor and much more assertive, right, when they go see the doctors. At least, by the way, there was one book that I read, oh, it's been probably 10 years ago, and I don't know if it's changed, is How to Talk to Your Doctor. And you've read that book? Well, you stopped. Yeah, yes. So, but how to talk to your doctor, because a lot of that's not something, the white lab coat, right? We take them, am I saying that right? The white lab coat? Okay, yeah. And so so some of us grew up thinking, you know, the doctor is the final, you know, is the expert, right? And we're the patient. So we assume a certain kind of a role as a patient. And so, so the impairment or the disability, okay, can be made better through medical and professional intervention, okay, through medications, surgery, therapies, et cetera, okay? So if you just do what the doctor says, right, everything's going to be fine. Has that been your experience? Some people. And also that experts on all aspects of disabilities and arbiters of decisions about us, about as people with disabilities, that the medical professionals are the experts on all aspects of disability. And so, and we know that, and by the way, I'm a firm believer in having, you know, quality medical care. But the roles, I think, need to be, we need to look at those roles, and I'm sure many of us do. But the experts on all aspects of disability, and the arbiters of decisions about us, that the medical professionals play that role. Also, that disability is a biological phenomenon, okay? That the disability and the person are synonymous, okay? Of course, we all know disability is a big part of who we are, but it's also, but there's more. But when you go see, I go to see my people, you know, when I go into my clinics, I had my kidney transplant 2 years ago. I go in to see my doctors, and they don't talk much about other things going on in my life, okay? They talk about, you know, kidney functions, all my lab values. Okay, that's what they talk about, and so that's what I go to them for, to make sure everything's working okay, and that if there's any medical intervention that may be needed, yes, but we're much more than that. And and that the impairment, okay, is the cause of all of our problems. Okay, that our disability is the cause of all of our problems, not discrimination, right? Right? I mean, I've never been to a doctor where they've asked me about discrimination. Have any of you been to a doctor where they've asked you about discrimination and the barriers that you face in the community, or that your family members face in the community? If you did, hang on to that doctor. But it doesn't address our long-term needs, right? Because you know, we only, you know, doctors, they're looking for a cure. Now, in some cases, there may not be, quote, the cure. But those long-term needs, obviously, there's a lot going on in our world, in our communities, and in our families, long-term, that physicians in the medical profession aren't going to be addressing. So I think that it's important to understand, that's sort of where the medical model is coming from. Now, Jess, you went through a medical program not too long ago, right, over at UAB. Is that, from your experience, what you saw in the medical field? I don't want to put you on the spot, but has that changed much?
I'm just gonna say that people see both faces better. So what's interesting about to me about the medical professionals, it depends on the profession.
Mhm.
Because when you're a physical therapist, we do a lot more full body treatment approach, but then it depends on what specialty you have with physical therapy. So for me, I would say I have the least amount of medical model in my practice because I was a public health therapist. So we did a lot of full body treatment, but we also assessed a lot of what was going on in people's lives because stress, trauma is a huge impact on the person as well. So I liked that, at least for me, but I made it that way. I wanted it to be a physical therapist that could see the whole body, like a person to person. It's not just what's going on at this table on. But I have friends who were in med school at UAB and friends at PA school though. And this was definitely very much prevalent that you get so driven and focused on, we have to treat, even if it's disability related. That makes sense. So I would say it depends on the profession because when we look at the history of allied professions, which is related to more your rehab type of professions, but there's no perfect rehab either, And that history was really interesting too. Most people forget that rehab professionals started as rehab nurses out of World War II. And that's how they got into the whole treatment approach away from the medical model, but we were always under the American Medical Association. So our hands were tied for a very long time until we got on our professional positions. So that's a little bit the medical degree from a rehab standpoint, but from a medical model standpoint, and I know when nurses say, would you say you felt like you were taught this in nursing school a little bit too? I typically find more of my doctors and PAs are taught this. What would you say to nurse?
I feel like in nursing school, we were more of a holistic, like look at every body system, but we were also taught to address like the mental, emotional needs.
And she basically
Sorry.
summarized. It's okay, my bad. I find professions to report to MDs typically. Not that all MDs are bad or anything, because I have wonderful doctors that I know of, but I typically find people who report to whoever's in charge of the team. It's the people in charge of the team, they're still taught on the medical model, and I think that's just hard. It's just gonna take time to switch, but I think I blame insurance. I blame a lot of things. I blame productivity, and a lot of people who are running hospitals today are not doctors first, so they're not really people first, they're more business first, so.
Yeah. And in that hierarchy, though, there is a hierarchy, though, within the medical profession, right? You don't get to see your physical therapists, or other medical provider without doctor's orders, right? So that's how the system works. And so that's something I think that, keep in mind when we're talking about independent living, the independent living philosophy, comparing that, say, to the medical model, okay? And a lot of this research, a lot of this writing was done probably in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so it'd be cool to have somebody go and update this, about what the medical model looks like in year 2024. So anyway, so there were different influences that bore down on that really helped shape the independent living philosophy. And those were major changes in our society back in the 60s. The civil rights movement, was certainly one of those. The civil rights movement, of course, goes way back, probably before the 60s, before the 50s, probably even before the 50s and 40s, and much earlier than that with the civil rights movement. Also, consumerism, and that is as individuals with disabilities looking for services, that you go in as a consumer, go in as an educated consumer, so that you have control you have autonomy and power over the services that you're receiving. It's not necessarily a professional. Has anybody, and by the way, there are other service systems that have adopted that medical model, not just what you call traditionally the medical profession, but other systems have bought into that medical model as well. Also, so self-help and non-professional peers, right? Non-professional peers. Now we do have and I think that self-help, we see a lot of that. A lot of people in this room today over the last 2 days have been, I guess, have been, you've been providing, support and ideas for one another. And that's really part of that concept of self-help. And that is non-professional. Now, many of you are professionals, right? In some capacity or another. You may not be a professional, may not be working, but for your purposes here, that's your role here is to provide support for one another. Also, demedicalization of our services, and that is, for example, personal assistance services. Okay, so some of you may have caregivers or personal assistants who come into your home, provide care and support. And so they're not, now it may be, say, through the Medicaid waiver program. And we could talk about the Medicaid waiver program for quite a while if we wanted to, but the Medicaid waiver programs, okay, and other in-home services like through home health services, the home health services are still pretty much a medical model service, whereas personal assistance services are not part of the medical model. They're part of, they really are, and people have been working on this to demedicalize it so that individuals who are using those services, who are, quote, the consumers of those services, are the ones directing those services. So if somebody comes into your home, say provide you with assistance with bathing and dressings and some other very personal needs, most people will want to be in charge of directing that individual rather than the person coming in providing that service is telling you how the service is going to be provided. Who knows your body better than you? And then deinstitutionalization, another major factor when we talk about some of those influences on independent living. And some of you may be able to think of some other influences as well. So the independent living philosophy, there are some cores and Josh, you could probably be talking about some of this as well, but some of the cores of the independent living philosophy, number one, probably one of the top ones is consumer control. And that is the individual with a disability being in control of the programs and services that they're participating in. So what does that look like, though, at a Center for Independent Living? It means that for an individual coming to a center, that the individual is the one who sets their goals. Okay. Now, we would get referrals, and Josh, you probably still see this, referrals maybe from a counselor or a therapist or a family member and say, I want you to work with my loved one, okay, to help them achieve these goals, okay? I don't know if you've ever heard that, Josh, but every single day we hear that. And so there's a response to that though, right? About what if that's the model you're looking for, this is probably not the right place. And so now we would get individuals in the door, and that very first conversation is with that individual to talk about what it is they hope to achieve. May not necessarily be what other family members want to see happen. And so, which can be a difficult conversation, but I think it's a conversation that's had every day at a Center for Independent Living. Board composition. And that's another way in which I think Centers for Independent Living are unique. And that is a majority of board members at a Center for Independent Living are individuals with significant disabilities, a majority. And then also the staff composition, and that is a majority of the staff at a Center for Independent Living are people with disabilities. So again, it's that, you know, the whole concept of, you know, when you come to a center, you can talk to somebody who's been through that, who's been through what you've been through. Now, it may not necessarily be somebody, and that gets into the next one, cross disability. When you come to a Center for Independent Living, centers work on, they don't turn anybody away because they don't have a particular disability. You know, so if you come to our center and you have a mobility impairment, you have a spinal cord injury, or if you have autism, or if you're deaf or you're blind, you'll be able to come to the Center for Independent Living for services and not be denied because you have a particular disability. That's something else that's at the core of what Centers for Independent Living do. And so that cross disability is extremely important. And so when you come to, if you come to a center and you're looking for services, you may have experienced some discrimination. And we talked about that yesterday. I think, you know, in terms of discrimination, the fact is that discrimination comes in many different forms. And what can happen is that when you come to a Center for Independent Living, you may not see somebody with your disability. You know, maybe you have autism and you're talking to somebody with a mobility impairment, or vice versa. And the fact is, discrimination, you're talking to somebody who's probably been there in terms of facing discrimination they've had and have had to deal with it in certain ways. And so that's something I think that, again, is unique for a Center for Independent Living in terms of the work that centers do. And also equal access. And that gets into a couple of different ways. Equal access in the center, at the Center for Independent Living, and also in the community. So when you come to a Center for Independent Living, you may or may not require an accommodation. And so if you require an accommodation, centers have to make that accommodation. And so that's part of that equal access. And sometimes you have to get creative with that. And so we have centers in this state that may have only 3 staff members or 4 staff members, the one in Huntsville. And so they're required, though, to meet these philosophical standards. So, but we have other ones that are larger, and so it's important, though, in terms of the equal access that we provide at the centers, but also in the community. So the work that centers do in the community to ensure that there's equal access. We have some people here who live in Birmingham or Homewood, Hoover, Jefferson County, this area, or not too far from here, Gadsden, not too far. But anyway, and so you've probably been up to Vulcan. You've been up to Vulcan, okay. And did you walk up the steps? Well, you walked up the steps, okay. Okay, we need to give these folks an award, because about 90% of the people who go over there take that elevator up to the top, you know? And so, but when they went through a restoration, I don't know if any of you had been to Vulcan before they did the renovation. Maybe some of you went as children before that. And so you could go to the top and you could, you know, take an elevator up and see all around the city of Birmingham. And then they came in to take it back to the original, I guess, is that sandstone on Vulcan? What kind of stone is that? But anyway, they took it back to the original. And so what the plan was going to be, the architects and designers and the people in charge, they were going to make it so they had this beautiful Vulcan, okay, statue, but they were not going to, because they thought it might detract from the look, they weren't going to install an elevator. And so just a little bit of history, you know, because, you know, we didn't think that was right. And so, you know, we organized some advocates to go and have a conversation with them. We had conversations with some people at the state and at the city of Birmingham. And so it's a city, Birmingham, it's a Birmingham city facility. And I was really proud of our mayor at the time when he said, if everybody can't go up, nobody goes up. Mayor Kincaid said that. I don't know if you ever remember Mayor Kincaid, but he said that. And so there's now an elevator there, which most people take going up there. We do have some ambitious people who will walk up there, but for most of us, we're going to take that elevator up. So no, and so what their accommodation was going to be, and this was all post ADA. This was after the ADA. What they were going to do, they were going to install a webcam up there. That would be how you'd experience Vulcan with a webcam. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but going up to Vulcan, top of Vulcan, and walking around there, and the wind blowing in your face, and that's a very different experience. Okay, maybe a little scarier. Okay, than watching a webcam. So that's what we mean when we talk about equal access, not just at the center, but also in our community. Equal access in transportation, housing, so many different areas. And then also, of course, self-help and self-advocacy. We're going to be talking about self-advocacy later today. And then those peer relationships. And so we talked about that when we
before you move on, you may hit this. Oh. Sorry.
Equal access.
Hey, this is Josh. Y'all will get to know me. But talk about the and you may hit this, but talk about dignity of risk.
The dignity of risk.
As far as consumer control.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. And that's not something we hear people talk a lot about, is it? And that is the dignity of risk. And any thoughts about what that means? We need the mic.
I'm Michelle. Giving someone the opportunity to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think we've all had that experience growing up, right? That dignity of risk in so many different ways. Maybe you've, maybe when you first time you moved out on your own, okay, you were given that dignity of risk, and sometimes it didn't work out, did it? You may have had a roommate you just didn't get along with at all. Anybody had that experience? So we're not going to name names, or maybe you just got your driver's license, right? And you went out on the interstate here. Can be kind of scary the first time you're out there. Actually, it's kind of scary every time I go out there on the interstate. But so those are the kinds of experiences, or if, let's say, you get a job, right? And you get this job, and there's never a guarantee that you're going to succeed on that job, right? I mean, you do the best that you can, right? With supports, you may need supports. But we all need some supports on our jobs, right? But at the same time, if there is some risk that it may not succeed. In fact, that dignity of risk is something, that's why a lot of people, or somebody who wants to live at home, in their own home, in the community, who may not want to go into a nursing home, okay? Let's say you have somebody, is that a message there, Linda? Okay. Oh, should I stand?
So it's always going to put the light in the projector, make everything else dark around. You can try putting up the lights a little bit, and it will help. Yeah, like right there. Okay.
Yeah. So let's say you need some in-home assistance, somebody to help you with that bathing and dressing and personal assistance, et cetera. But one of the very first things or the go-to position has been, well, let's send some person to rehab, get as much function as possible on their activities of daily living. All too often, there are people who from there go into a nursing home. There's a pipeline, say, from hospitals to nursing homes. And so then there's concern amongst some of the medical professionals. This individual, it's too risky for this person to be out there on their own, right? Because anything can happen. Well, anything can happen. But at the same time, it's your call, right? If you're that person in the nursing home. And there are people we've worked with for more than a year who've been trying to get out, right? And have not had the resources, or really they've been discouraged from leaving, right? They've been discouraged from leaving nursing homes because they want to go out and live independently in the community. And so that there's that, what we call a dignity of risk. And too often people with disabilities, particularly people with significant disabilities, have been denied that dignity of risk.
And I like you brought that up because it ties in. You hear me?
Just make sure you hold that top button until it turns green.
It's on.
I don't have you here. Come on. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, Josh. Because we're getting into it today because we're talking about the movement of self-advocacy, but a lot of people forget that dignity of risk is required to be an effective self-advocate as well, especially if you're somebody with a disability themselves. So I love that you hit that because there's so much time between the independent living and history of self-advocacy. And we're kind of go through the self-advocacy chart. If you guys know what I'm talking about, if you don't, we'll talk about that next.
So Josh, anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted you to bring that up.
Okay. Well, thanks. Yeah. Okay, and I hope you can see this. I'll describe. So when we talk about the different influences on the independent living movement, there are several, including the civil rights movement. We have in this first column a photo or an image of Dr. King. And below that is an image of people marching across the bridge in Selma. We also have the women's rights movement, the equality. There's somebody up there, women holding signs that say equality now. I guess that may have been the National Organization of Women. By the way, some of you may recall the Equal Rights Amendment actually did pass and still hasn't been ratified. Could be ratified, is my understanding. Could still be ratified, but still some. So there's still some people who think that's I guess government overreach. But anyway, so the women's rights movement were one of those movements back in those days. There's also gay rights. And the first photo below that is a photo of a man, Harvey Milk. Some of you may recall that name or know of Harvey Milk, who was he was on the, I believe he was on the city council or city commission in San Francisco, and actually was a confidant of Dianne Feinstein. She was on the San Francisco council at that time. And so Harvey Milk was assassinated I believe it was at City Hall in San Francisco. So he was a major force behind gay rights in those days. And then also below that, we see signs of gay power and some other marchers as well. So these were some of the influences these were some of the influences on the independent living movement and some of the things that were going on at that time, back in the 60s. And the consumer movement, okay? And so you get bonus points if you can identify who this person is up on the left. It's a person sitting at wearing his sort of bushy hair, and he's sitting, I guess, probably at a press conference or something, looking very intently. Any idea who this person is?
Michelle Ralph Nader.
Ralph Nader, yes. Okay. Okay. Some of you may recall, no, you may have read about him. Okay, you may have read about Ralph Nader. Hey, we're there, okay? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so Ralph Nader was a consumer advocate, very, are we? Okay. Okay, should I wait? Okay, so have any of you ever bought a new car and gotten a recall notice? Yeah. Yeah, probably just about everybody who's bought a new car has had some sort of recall notice, right? And there are hundreds of thousands of recall notices that come out that people have gotten. And so, yeah, that happened to me twice. Actually, we had one of those Hyundais that were being stolen, right? The TikTok and yeah, the Kia, the Sonatas, the Kias, and the Elantra. We had a Sonata and an Elantra. So yeah, so we were pretty vulnerable. Luckily, we traded them both in. So, but anyway, so those are some recalls because okay, that came out, and so it's not because the car manufacturers think, oh, we really want to take care of our customers. You think that's the reason they're doing it? I mean, but anyway, there may be some people, at the manufacturers who feel that way, but anyway, so this car here, you get, okay, bonus points, more bonus points if you can tell what kind of car this is. Josh.
Josh, I'm going to guess a Ford Galaxy.
No. Okay.
Michelle, maybe a Pinto?
Along those same lines, but yeah, not a Pinto. Yeah. No, this is a Corvair. Okay, so yeah, most likely you've not seen one of these on the road. Maybe if you go to a car show, you might want to see an antique car show, you might see a Corvair. But he wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. And so what would happen is this Corvair would spin out of control, okay, under certain circumstances. Okay, and some people got killed. Okay, and there are other cars since the Corvair, and this is back in the 60s. And so he wrote a book about that. And so one thing that happened then, sort of after this was exposed, is the Transportation Safety Board actually started a program to recall automobiles, okay, with safety issues. I think the Pinto was one of those that was called. That was called back. Maybe the Chevette. There's some other cars that really had some significant safety problems. Was the Pinto, if they got hit from behind, may explode? Was that the Pinto? Okay, yeah. Has something to do with the gas tank? I'm not exactly sure, but something. Yeah. So these things just don't happen by chance, okay? That these changes are made in the process of manufacturing automobiles. It's not by chance. Yeah, I'm sure they want to have safe cars, but with the Corvair, I think they were saving probably $10 or $20 per unit, okay, in the design, something they could have done differently, and they didn't do it. So anyway, but you see that not just in automobiles, but also in other kinds of products. More recently, is it the CPAP machines? Have you heard about the CPAP machines? What did you hear about the CPAP machines? Yeah,
I had that CPAP machine.
Okay, you had that.
Yeah, and it was recalled because during use, it would emit vapors, toxic fumes, vapors, and you'd be inhaling that in your sleep.
Mhm.
I was working at a medical equipment company. We did the CPAPs and the ventilators that had the same foam filter. And there was a lot of back and forth about what it actually caused. I think there was a lot less people that were affected about it, but we couldn't send patients that needed ventilators home for an extended period of time that had to stay in the hospital because there was no appropriate alternative, and you had to wait until they changed it, and then we start it was a mess.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's still a hot mess because we've got 2 of those at home.
Yeah.
Eh, What are you gonna do? What do you do without them? Yeah, they don't like to send you stuff.
I'm Mary from Robertsdale. So the home ventilators, like you were saying, they say that the foam filter inside the vent can release gas, but also can release particles. But you have a filter that's upstream from that they tell you that should, keyword should, prevent any issues with gas related or particle related getting into like the trach or whatever you have. We were told 6 months after the recall came out from our home health company, when another parent posted this, hey, do you know anything about this on a trach group site? And parents were like, yeah, we're just learning about this. But we were told there's no other ventilators on the market, and there's such a shortage of ventilators that you either have a ventilator or not. So it's like you either take that risk or you have nothing. So.
Yeah,
And this is
so,
Linda. When we're thinking, the ventilators, like we have one and then we have a backup. Sometimes you get a backup, sometimes you don't. And they want to take our backup away. I know in the other states, they give you one, you get a backup, because if you don't, then what happens when, so we have a backup and it's like, we don't want to tell anybody, we don't want to give it, and it's hard to keep those.
mhm.
A lot of problems.
Right, yeah, so again, this, so when you look back, would we be seeing, and of course, this is something that's very recent, right? We're talking, the early 2020s, right? And I don't know if it went back before that, but, part of the consumer movement. And so where people have the expectation that the equipment that they're purchasing or the product or the service they're purchasing is going to work correctly and it's not going to hurt them. And so this certainly probably can apply to other kinds of devices. And so anyway, so this is part of, the consumer movement. That is somebody who's shopping for a service, person with a disability is shopping for a service, or receiving services. It could be funded by the state. It could be funded by the federal government. It could be through private insurance. That you want to be a savvy consumer of those services. So what you want to make sure the services that you get are working, that meet your needs, but at the same time aren't harming you. And so that's where this consumer movement came in. And so same as a consumer at a center for independent living, you have the right as a consumer and that's the term used. Some people don't like that term, but anyway, the term consumer is pretty much the accepted term at a center for independent living, as somebody who comes to the center, that you have an expectation of that the goals you're going to be working on are your goals. Okay, they're not the goals of your independent living specialists. Okay, or your peer supporter, that they're your goals, and so that you're respected for that. So there are other movements, the self-help movement, and probably one of the most famous self-help movements is the AA, Alcoholics Anonymous now NA, Narcotics Anonymous. But anyway, AA goes back probably to the 30s. So it's been around for a very, very long time. It's going to be it's going to be what, probably 90 years since AA started and is still going. So Alcoholics Anonymous is probably one of the most well-known examples of self-help movements. Just as an aside, okay, my wife has a friend, well, actually somebody she went to high school with, and he lives in Ohio, near the Akron area, which is where it got started, Akron, Ohio. Actually, they've been doing some renovations on this original AA house, okay, that they had used. And so this person actually was working on that. I guess he was a member of AA himself. So anyway, so I don't know if it's open to the public, but if you ever get up in that area, it might be worth checking out. Of course, demedicalization. And so we have here, we have a man and maybe his daughter, or we're not sure what the relationship is here. And then there's a young girl standing next to him, and then there's a man standing behind him. And so they have, so we talk about demedicalization. We talk about, once you go home, yeah, you may need some medical support, like a CPAP machine or some other type of service like that. But when you get home, you don't always have, nor do you want, the presence of nurses and doctors sort of running your life at home. You've got to make decisions for yourself, and you want to make decisions for yourself. And that's where this demedicalization comes in. And deinstitutionalization, I don't know if Jess is still here, but she's going to be, I know she touched on that. She touched on that the other session yesterday. And so anyway, anybody recall now, y'all know who this person is on the left? If you can everybody see this, by the way? I'm assuming you can all see this, but I don't want to make that assumption. Person on the left. Anybody know who that is? You know.
Geraldo Rivera. Sorry,
Yeah.
Renee.
So
He
what-
broke his nose, got his face punched on live TV. That's how I know him.
What's that?
He broke his nose. He got his face punched on live TV.
Yeah,
And
so
they broke
that's
his
what
nose.
he's known for now, right? That's what you remember about Geraldo now, right? And yeah, and some of the shows he was on, right? What kind of shows? Why would he get his face broke? I mean, he's a trash talker. Yeah. Well, this person who got his face broke on TV and is a trash talker, at one time was an investigative reporter and went into Willowbrook Institution and did an investigative report. Really, I mean, as a reporter, great work, okay? And really brought a lot of attention to what was going on at Willowbrook. So, and of course, the next photo is, and Josh, or I think Jess talked about Willowbrook and there's a photo of Willowbrook, some of the residents of Willowbrook in Staten Island. And then also we have on the right, Bryce Hospital. And I don't know if ADAP is going to be talking more about the work they've done with Bryce in that, in the case of, in the lawsuit that they were involved in for what, probably 20 years. And so to bring people out of Bryce Hospital and into the community. But Bryce Hospital, what's kind of interesting, goes back, gosh, probably to the mid-19th century. It's been around for a long time. And so it was at one time, they placed it in those days, Jess, we were just talking about these mental hospitals were like Bryce and others around the country were sort of in these pastoral settings where people could come and I guess, work the farm and do things like that. So they thought that would have been therapeutic. So Bryce Hospital at one time, I think the number was over 5,000 residents. Yeah, so it was huge. Can you imagine what kind of treatment you'd get, okay, in a facility with 5,000? Wouldn't be treatment, would it? No. Term I would probably use would be warehousing.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I will forget if I don't say this because I think I have something wrong with me, but that hasn't, even if we've moved to like special needs foster, or medically fragile foster care for our pediatric kids in Alabama, this hasn't changed a lot. Like even in private foster, like medically fragile homes, I have parents that function like a Willowbrook employee that are getting paid by the state allegedly to care for medically complex kids. So it's great that this is shut down, but this is not done. That mentality is still very present.
Yeah, yeah.
And there you go, the home and community-based services issue that we faced in Alabama last year.
Hmm?
The HCBS rule and all that.
Right, right. And yeah, the HCBI, I think that would be, if it's not on the agenda for the next several, up through May, I think that should be. But yeah, yeah. The rule setting, yeah, we could, yeah, that's, yeah, when I was at April last year, that was something we were involved in the rule setting. And I know that Alabama, I know ADAP was involved in that with some other organizations. These are basically rules about in-home care and in-home services, okay? That you have basically, but basically have your basic freedoms, okay? And so, for example, if you're saying and living in some residential home that you have, if you want to, you can lock your door, okay? Or if you want to have visitors, you can have visitors come in. Some very basic rights, things that we all take for granted. And so I think that's something that I think would be really important, I think, for everybody to know. And what's happened since then? And so what they did, they came out to different facilities in each state, and they did reviews, and then they went back, and the feds did. They went back, wrote up reports, and asked for responses. And I think it'd be very great if somebody. I don't know if y'all are going to have to do projects for part of this. Is that kind of the expectation, that there are projects you work on? That might be an interesting one to find out what's happened since then. But you bring up a really good point. Thank you for that. Okay, so now we're getting into legislation. And so this is starting in the 60s. And so again, talking about rights that affect people with disabilities. This is in the 60s. And so I think y'all know who this is, right? I mean, iconic, even if you didn't grow up in the 60s. So here's a photo of Jimi Hendrix. And so anyway, so this was back in the 60s. And so Ed Roberts, okay, Ed Roberts actually was one of the very first, actually he was the first student with a significant disability. The term back in those days, they used severe. They don't really use that term anymore, severe disability, but significant disability. He used a vent. He was quadriplegic and actually had a ventilator, actually used a ventilator, okay? And he was one of the first students with a severe disability to attend University of California at Berkeley. And so he lived, actually, they actually lived, because there was no housing in those days for students with significant disabilities. He lived in the student health center section on campus. So other students living in dorms. Ed was living at the student health center. And so, but he saw a need for campus community access and personal assistance. So, you know, Ed went there, was one of the first ones, and others came after Ed to attend Berkeley. And so over time, word got out that there were these students, and over time, they would really be providing support for one another, you know, things like wheelchair maintenance and things of that nature. And so, you know, and ultimately people would be moving out into the community. You know, they'd be leaving campus and maybe getting an apartment or some living situation out in the community. So people would need to have ramps. They go out in the community, and the community was not real accessible. You know, Berkeley in those days. Berkeley was not very accessible in those days. We think now Berkeley is probably one of the most accessible places in the country, although there are probably advocates in Berkeley who would probably disagree with that. but Berkeley, and so students would advocate. They'd get together and advocate, right? So they get together and advocate for, say the city of Berkeley or the campus to make changes, so to build ramps, okay, build curb ramps or curb cuts, whatever term you want to use, to build curb cuts, which we see. You go downtown, with some exceptions, there are some exceptions, right, where we have curb cut. There's still areas that don't have curb cuts, right? We've got a long way to go. But it's pretty well expected though, right? The expectations are higher now that our communities are accessible. And if they're not, we have rights to enforce those. We have laws that enforce those rights. But in those days though, and so what those students would do is, if they weren't getting, they weren't getting the campus or the or the city to make those changes, to build curb cuts. So what are you going to do if the city doesn't do that? What are your, this was before the ADA, there was no ADA. And so what are you going to do? And so what a group of them did was they got some jackhammers and they went out and they built their own curb cuts, okay, on the sidewalks, okay? So if you go out to the Berkeley campus, you'll see the first curb cut in the country. What they say is there's a monument to it. And so again, if you ever go out to the Bay Area, go check that out on the Berkeley campus. But I was just a little story. I had been for a number of years, I was doing some reviews of centers for independent living, and that happened to be one of them. I went to the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, and so I was talking to somebody at the Center for Independent Living. He was working there, and he was telling me that he was part of that group that went out, and so it was great to meet somebody who was actually involved in that, doing that work. And so he was telling me about the work they did, and he was saying, and it was my jackhammer, okay, that they took out, but I haven't gotten it back, okay? They never gave my jackhammer back. So anyway, so sometimes you got to give it up for the cause, right? So, and of course, they saw the need for personal assistance, for people to come in to assist with helping the students with their daily needs. So there were some key legislation, and this is not comprehensive. There are going to be some other legislations, that occurred back in the 60s. And this was the Architectural Barriers Act, okay? And of the 1960s. So that's federal buildings that are built, altered, or leased, okay, have to be accessible, have to meet certain accessibility standards, guidelines. And it also created the U.S. Access Board. U.S. Access Board is an organization. I remember we used to have somebody from Alabama who was on the U.S. Access Board, but the U.S. Access Board has a lot of responsibilities for working on regulations around accessibility, okay? And so, and developing those regulations and standards. And so the Access Board was created back in those days, the very early days. And so, for example, before that, you might go to a post office and it wouldn't be accessible. And so, or if you go to, say, a courthouse, a federal courthouse, wouldn't necessarily be accessible. And so, but it's taken a while, right? Some of you may have been to post offices that weren't real accessible. I mean, that was still, I know people would complain in their communities where their post office still was not accessible, and that was probably 20 or 30 years after the passage of the Architectural Barriers Act. So, and so the U.S. Access Board, that's probably something you want to put on your save on your computer, and that is the U.S. Access Board, because there's a lot of great resources up there. And they do have hearings, okay? They're open to the public, and I think they're doing those now. It used to be all in person. I believe they're doing them now virtually. So it might be useful just to sit in, just to see what's, and the people on the Access Board are appointed by the president. And so it's something that if you or maybe somebody you know might want to be on the access board. So, so anyway, so it is something though that has been around now, gosh, how many years? 68 to 2024, 24 plus 30, over 50 years. Yeah. Okay, and this is a photo of President Johnson signing of the Architectural Barriers Act. Now, we assuming that's what the bill that he's signing. So just take my word, okay? He's signing that bill. Okay, the 70s. There were some other, any from others from the 60s that you can think of that you think might be, okay, yeah. Yeah, or there are things maybe you're gonna be talking about later.
Back to our PowerPoint, but
Okay.
if you
Yeah.
look, yeah.
Yeah, there's, of course, the Civil Rights Act, right, was
Exactly.
passed. And the mid-60s, and of course, you know, when the Civil Rights Act passed, there was a lot of opposition to it, right? Really virulent pushback on the Civil Rights Act, but it did get through. And if you haven't seen some of the documentaries about how it got passed, I think it would be well worth your time to look at that. But the Civil Rights Act at that time did not include people with disabilities. Okay, so that was to come later. So this is a photo, and I think you all know who this is, right? He's a little older now, and not quite the same figure that he used to be. But this is John Travolta, okay, and I cannot remember his co-star with that. But anyway, so this is John Travolta from Saturday Night Fever. Yes, okay. I'll be honest, I never had, okay, a leisure suit like that. Okay, I never did wear those. So I never did. Okay, you'll never find any photos of me wearing a leisure suit. Although they were very popular in the day. But anyway, so see that floor there? That disco floor that they used? Anybody been over to the club? That's the disco floor. That's the floor that they used in the movie. Yeah. I didn't know that until we were going to do some event over there, and I was talking to their marketing person, say, "Oh yeah, this floor here was used in the movie Saturday Night Fever." So I thought that was pretty cool. So yeah, so this was back in Berkeley, the Physically Disabled Students Program. And it's for those who, okay, based upon the idea that those who know best the needs of disabled people and how to meet those needs are the disabled people themselves. Seems pretty common sense to us today, doesn't it? Well, it didn't going back 3,500 years, right? And also the needs of the disabled. Now, we don't use those terms, but this was from years ago. The needs of the disabled can be met most effectively by comprehensive programs which provide a variety of services. So we're talking about the students back in those days, okay? The organization they created really planted the seeds for the first Center for Independent Living, this organization. And then disabled people should be fully integrated in their community. And again, this was founded in 1970 when this organization was founded. So the first Center for Independent Living was in Berkeley, California, starting in 1972. And it was founded by Ed Roberts. And we saw his photo. Again, I want to encourage you to do some research on Ed. And it was a reaction to, if anybody's in graduate school working on a degree, this might be a great paper. But anyway, it was a reaction to the medical model, okay, that we talked about. And also the rehabilitation model, the more traditional rehabilitation model, and the institutional model, okay? So this is, when Ed went to Berkeley, he wanted support from the state through their state rehabilitation program, and initially didn't get that support. The thought then was that Ed didn't have, at least according to one individual, okay, made this decision that Ed didn't have the potential for work, for gainful employment. And so we probably still see some of that today. Yeah, we still see some of that today. But Ed was told, you know, of course, go forward maybe another 10 years or so. Ed became the commissioner of the agency that denied him services, supervising all the counselors. Yeah, that's how you do it. That's how you do it. Yep. 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 So he was appointed by Governor Jerry Brown to be over the rehabilitation services in the state of California. So, and of course, now I mentioned Ed's mother. I think it would be really, I think you'd really learn a lot, you know, to know more about Zona and some of the work that she did. And she was a fierce advocate on Ed's behalf. In fact, she lived, I don't know if she may have lived to almost 100 years old, but anyway, she was an amazing advocate, okay, working with her son. And of course, so she was, you know, just a, what's the word that was used yesterday? Mama bear? Mama bear. Okay. I guess, I don't know if they called them mama bears back in those days, but yeah, she probably was one of the very first mama bears in disability rights. But anyway, so, and I'm sure everybody in here is as well, those mothers. And so here's the Ed Roberts campus today. And so it holds probably, I had a chance to visit this when it was under construction and come back later and see it when it was fully developed. But they actually built the Ed Roberts Center is, I don't know how many thousands of square feet, probably over 30,000, maybe even more than that. But the Ed Roberts campus, they call it a campus, houses the Center for Independent Living, plus a number of other nonprofit disability organizations. So I would put this on my travel list if I go out there again, is to go visit the Ed Roberts Center. And so, in fact, yeah, so they actually built a separate subway, or the BART stop, the BART system out in California, the transportations. They built a separate BART stop for the Ed Roberts campus, which I thought was, talk about some incredible advocacy. Those folks were doing some amazing advocacy back in those days. And so what you see is the front of it. And then over on the right, you see a photo of the inside. And what you see on the inside, and I had not seen this before, this is a ramp, okay, that goes from the first floor to the second floor. And so I don't know if any of you have ever seen a building that has a ramp like that, but it meets ADA, ADA guidelines. And so you can, if you don't want to take the elevator, you can take this ramp, this amazing ramp from the first floor to the second, or go down. And so anyway, it really is something to see if you ever get a chance to go out there. So Jess, are we going to be talking a little later about the 504 sit-in? So I won't go into much depth about this, but this was the 504 sit-in at the federal building in 1977. 77? Yeah.
That last night.
We saw a little bit of, yeah.
Scenes of that last night.
Mm-hmm.
Screen that movie.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And yeah, what'd y'all think of that movie? Yeah. Yeah. What about the Black Panthers were involved in helping them. It was really an amazing, it was like 30 days.
What?
It was about 30 days, I think. 26 days. Okay. Yeah, I've seen the movie. I would like to hear the discussion though. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. Oh, and by the way, Judy Heumann came, and I don't know, I can't recall if that was in the movie, came to Berkeley and worked as Ed Roberts' deputy director. Can you imagine those two? Okay, you're on the city council and those two come to a meeting or a meeting with the governor. Okay, and so would have been great to have been around those days just to be part of that. But anyway, yeah. So Judy was, yeah, and so she went on to help. She and Ed, went to the World Institute on Disability. But that would have been some amazing conversations happening back in those days. And so yeah, and so it took like a lot of laws, sometimes it takes a while for the regulations to be implemented. And so if the regulations aren't implemented, there isn't much you can do with that law. And so those regulations actually were finally implemented or written and implemented after the sit-in. So legislation of this in the 70s, the Rehab Act, okay, which prohibits discrimination. It really wasn't a very long piece of legislation, but very powerful. And that is prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs receiving federal financial assistance. So if you're advocating, you may be advocating for IDEA, but you also have other tools that you can use, and that's obviously the ADA, as well as Section 504. And so that's something sort of keep in mind when you're advocating. And so, and the thing that's, I think, interesting, and I don't know how, I think it probably has happened, but with Section 504, the federal government, if somebody's not complying with 504, found out of compliance, the feds can withhold money from those entities. So there's some teeth there, but anyway, so 504, and then 1975, the Education of All Handicapped Children's Act. That's the language that they used back in those days. Jess, you're going to be talking a little bit more about IDEA. Okay. And then 1978 were the Rehab Act amendments. Okay. And so that was a very important piece of legislation. And from that grew the Centers for Independent Living, funding for Centers for Independent Living. And so initially there were like 10 centers, federally funded centers, I think in 79 or 80, right around that time frame. So, and then soon after there were other centers came on board. The money for a Center for Independent Living in Alabama came in 1980. So actually, it wasn't long after that those funds became available. And there are some really, so really it grew from 10 centers to where we're at today. And there's something like, just talking about federally funded centers for independent living, I think it's around between 355 and 360, somewhere right around there. And so those are federally funded centers. Now there are other centers for independent living, like the one in Huntsville. Okay, there are 3 federally funded centers for independent living in this state. Huntsville is what they call a Title VII Part B center, so they don't get what we call the Part C money. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So in the 80s, okay, so this brings us into the 80s, and so I think y'all know who that is. This is Michael Jackson. And so what happened in the 80s? Of course, 1980, the Birmingham Independent Living Center was founded. That was the first center for independent living in the state of Alabama. There would be others to follow, although it took way too long for funding to become available for these centers, to get started. Then in 1980, the National Council on Independent Living was founded. And people like Ed Roberts and Judy Heumann, Max Starkloff, and who was with the Center for Independent Living, Paraquad in St. Louis, and some others really were the ones who founded the National Council on Independent Living. So, or nickel. If you hear somebody use the word nickel, that's what they're talking about. And so that was, and then And so in 1988, Birmingham Independent Living Center was awarded a grant to provide independent living services in Southwest Alabama. And so, which is Mobile. And so it wasn't, and so they got established, and it wasn't long after that that they spun off to become their own center for independent living, independent. I mean, we are talking about independent living centers. And so that's something that occurred with Michael Davis when he was the executive director down in Mobile. So this is a logo of a group called the Alabama Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, or ACCD. And the ACCD was, you probably haven't heard of it, but ACCD was really a very effective cross-disability advocacy group in the state of Alabama back in the 70s and in parts of the 80s. They actually used to be, the ACCD was the governing, you see the logo shows the Alabama map. And so actually it was a statewide organization comprised of different, it was a coalition of different disability organizations. There's an organization representing people with physical disabilities. There was another organization representing people who were deaf. There was another organization representing people who were blind. There was another, and there were several other organizations as well. And they actually comprised the governing board for the Center for Independent Living, which got kind of complicated because we had people say people from Dothan, Huntsville, Tuscaloosa, wherever. There was some really good statewide participation, really being the governing board for the Center for Independent Living in Birmingham. And ultimately, as I said, the Mobile Center spun off. And so in the 80s, there was some key legislation, and that is the 1986 reauthorization of the Rehab Act. And with that, and I'm just talking about how it affected the independent living program. And that is directed RSA to develop performance standards. Before that, there were no standards as to what that centers had to meet in order to receive federal funding. In fact, when the first time I came to the center, this is in '89, they ultimately did develop some standards, but came to the center in 1989. It was over on 5th Avenue South and 35th Street, if any of you know where that is. If you know where Mayor Electric is in Birmingham, it was right across the street. There's a pool spa place or whatever. But anyway, I came in there and there was a pool table in there. There's a pool table at the Center for Independent Living. I mean, so there are recreation type programs at some of the centers. And so this is before we had any sorts of standards, and there were a lot of things that were going on that you probably wouldn't be seeing today at centers. Also required a majority of Center for Independent Living board members to be comprised of people with disabilities. Before that, that was not a requirement, that you had a majority of your board be comprised of people with disabilities. And we talk about people with disabilities, cross disabilities, not just, there was, for example, a Center for Independent Living at one time in Georgia. Their board was comprised of all deaf people. Other ones have come around, and so you're supposed to be cross disability. And so you're required to be cross disability. And so at that time, that wasn't happening in some states. And also the creation of the state independent living councils. I'll talk a little bit more about state independent living councils in a bit, but okay, we've got a little bit more time left. If you want to get up and go to feel free to do so.
You've got 30 minutes left on your presentation.
Okay.
Or 25.
Okay.
For you, and then we're going to take a break.
Okay.
For an hour and lunch and checking out a room. So
okay.
You got 20 minutes.
Okay.
25 minutes.
But okay, my thought is, if you have to go, leave for any reason, I'm not, it's none of my business, but to leave, feel free to do so. But so, yeah, so independent living councils, and in those days, 1986 to about 1992, they were really advisory councils. That's all they were. They were just advisory. So basically didn't really have any teeth. Okay, the 90s. Some of you are going to get this one. Who we have up here? Probably.
Kurt Cobain, I heard at this table. Is
Yeah.
that right?
Jill, yes.
Michelle. That's not Michelle. Yeah. So that's Kurt Cobain from Nirvana. And so, okay. And so there was some key federal legislation, okay, that passed in the 90s, starting in 1990, okay? And that is a great way to start the decade, passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so here's a photo of President Bush, the first President Bush, signing the ADA. And so Lex Frieden, who's still involved with the independent living research utilization out of Houston, he actually started it, ILRU. He was friends with the Bush family. So those connections are so important. And so it was a bright, beautiful day when the ADA was signed. And so, of course, you see on the right is Justin Dart, gentleman wearing the cowboy hat. And the person on the left is Evan Kemp. And so actually both Evan Kemp, I believe Justin was a Republican. I don't know if they remained Republican, but he's Republican. I think Evan Kemp was as well. So anyway, both those individuals had ties, you know, to President Bush, and were on the stage, or on the stage when he signed it. And then below, though, you know, we mentioned the National Council on Independent Living. Nickel started in 1980. They were involved, okay, in helping to draft the ADA, and to push it over the top for it to have it passed. And this is Marca Bristow. She was a Nickel president. She helped draft. She was former Nickel president. She helped draft the ADA along with some others. And so, well, many others do take credit, and I'm not going to question any individuals, but they have. And so Mark was part of that. Nickel was part of that process. Nickel was had you know, members actually from all across the country, the Center for Independent Living. So they did the organizing with the Centers for Independent Living for passage of the ADA. And so there were, as I said, there were a lot of people involved in the passage of the ADA. We've heard of Tom Harkin. Okay, Tom Harkin actually was a great friend to Nickel in the independent living movement. And he'd always talked about his story about his brother who was deaf. And so, in fact, Nickel gives out an award every year on in the name of Senator Harkin's brother, the Frank Harkin Award. But anyway, so you know, a number of legislators, you know, both of the Alabama senators voted in support of the ADA. Okay. I believe at that time it was Richard Shelby and maybe Hal Heflin, might have been Hal Heflin in those days. We also had, you know, support, you know, with our congressional delegation. So, I mean, there was pretty much widespread bipartisan support for the ADA, and which it makes me wonder these days, could we get bipartisan support for the ADA in 2024? I'm just glad it passed when it did. But anyway, but one of the individuals who was a big part of this is Major Owens, and he had a committee that was assigned to working on the ADA. And so here's a quote. He was from Brooklyn. He was a congressman from Brooklyn. And so Yoshiko Dart, who was Justin Dart's wife, made the statement that the disability community success in passing the ADA would not have been possible without the opportunity, the encouragement, or the support that Major Owens gave us. Okay, so Major Owens is one of those people we don't hear a lot about, but has had a significant role in the passage of the ADA. It was his idea, okay, when as part of this committee, his idea to really make sure that you know, Congress got as much information as they could to hear the stories from people around the state, around the states about what was going on. So Justin Dart traveled to all states and would just listen about the stories that people faced in terms of discrimination in their communities, okay, in their state and in their communities. And so from that, a report was developed, and based upon that report, they used that report to help pass the ADA, for the passage of the ADA. So it was really Major Owens and his encouragement, encouraging Justin to travel around the country to get these stories, that really helped us move the ADA forward. Now, when the ADA, and I don't know if you have the Capitol crawl, a photo of that, but anyway, one of the other things that happened is the ADA was, you know, they're trying to get it up for a vote in the Senate, and the Senate was dragging their feet like sometimes they do. And so people started coming to the Capitol, getting out of the wheelchairs and crawling up the steps of the Capitol. The Capitol, that's what the Capitol.
So we'll talk about it when we cover it. But the important that Congressman Major Owens helped, he was trying to defend this bill on the floor. It passed through the Senate with no problem, and it was stalled in the House of Representatives because a Republican from Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, Schuster at the end, was trying to put an amendment in that would prevent accessible transportation. About that, whole up to the Capitol crawl as well. So I like to say that this entire ADA pass was because of not just the people in the Congress, but also the people that were known as radical advocates for also this. And I know it was implied when I was starting reading on Major Owens. I'm not going to as much today because you cover him. He would give them secret information so they had understanding of how they could battle why it was solved. So yep.
Yes. And people like Senator Harkin people thought it was just very, wasn't a good look, right? People crawling up the Capitol steps in their wheelchairs. And so and of course, they told, you know, they were, you know, senators talking to each other, and one of them told people to stop doing that. This is a really bad look, which is the whole point, actually, right? And so Tom Harkin told people, keep them coming, keep them coming. So yeah, so Tom Harkin was. And so this is an article from the Birmingham Post-Herald. At one time, Birmingham had 2 newspapers that I remember. And so this is on Wednesday, August 17th, 1998. And so this was something, this was when Justin Dart came to Birmingham. Right over here at the, you know, where the golf course is off of Claremont Avenue, okay? There was a clubhouse up there. It's my understanding, it was before my time, but it was up there. So, you know, my predecessor was one of the people who helped organize that. And they had an amazing turnout. This here is Barbara Crozier, who was a strong advocate for many, many years here in the state of Alabama. But you know, there's one story about one of the parents gave, said their child was told they would never work, and then their child had since gotten a job, now working. This was back in 1988, and other individuals talk about, you know, accessibility in their communities. So it's something that I think it's helpful to know what what our national history is, but also what the history is in our state and what's happened locally. And so the legislation in 1992, okay, was the reauthorization of the Rehab Act. Supposed to happen about every 5 years. That hasn't been the case. But in what it did in terms of independent living, okay, it added systems advocacy as a core service that you have to provide as a center for independent living. So if you're not doing systems advocacy, you're not fulfilling your requirements under the Rehab Act. Defined what consumer control was, okay, went into more detail about what consumer control means. It also provided, which Center for Independent Living, we're so happy to see this, direct funding from the federal government to the Centers for Independent Living. And I think y'all know some of the problems dealing with trying to get your funding through the state. You know, sometimes there can be a challenge. And Centers for Independent Living were no different back in the 80s and early 90s, getting that direct funding. So getting that direct funding made all the difference in the world. I know as a center director at that time, I was so glad to see that. You know, we would send documents like probably 2 to 3 inches thick, send those to Montgomery, had to wait for them to review it. They come back, well, we're off, 50 cents on some travel form or whatever. So we have to redo it. I mean, so anyway, it was, we were very pleased to see that. And again, that was Nickel. That was what Nickel did. The National Council on Independent Living really pushed to make that happen. And so it wouldn't have happened without Nickel and other advocates pushing it. And also created the state independent living councils, which now, and they actually had a role. States, it actually became a governing body, okay, that was based upon the DD council model in a way. And that's really, and so there's a state independent living council. They meet, I think, quarterly in the state of Alabama, but it's their job to develop the state plan for independent living. And so we'll talk just in another minute about what the State Independent Living Council is, also called the SILC, S-I-L-C. You may hear that term. You may have heard that term, the SILC, yeah. So, and also defined what the standards were for centers for independent living. You know, the services you had to provide, administratively, what you need to be doing. So the number of things, how to ensure, consumer control. So those were the standards for centers for independent living that really came about in 1990s. So we get to the 2000s. Y'all know who this is, right?
Michelle, the Black Eyed Peas.
Yep. Yeah, Black Eyed Peas. Yeah. So what also happened in the 2020 Disability Resource Network, the new Center for Independent Living was founded. So as I said, it's operating. There's no federal funding coming directly to that center. It's actually some funding, what they call Part B money. There's Part B money that goes to the State Independent Living Council, decides how those funds are to be spent. And then Part C money goes directly to the Centers for Independent Living. So some other key legislation in the 2000s, the ADA Amendments Act, which was huge because it helped really define who was covered by the ADA. And so there were people, let's say somebody had mitigating measures, okay, for their disability. Say you take a medication, say for seizures, you may have been denied coverage under the ADA because you took these mitigating measures that were successful, right? So if you're a person who had seizures, taking medications, you may not have been, you're taking medications for your seizures and it was successful, you may not have been covered by the ADA. That clarified that, where now you would be covered, okay, in 2008. I was very pleasantly surprised that happened. This actually happened under the second George Bush president, so it was under his presidency. So the Bush family has had a lot to do with the ADA. And then 2014, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. What time do we have? Okay, Jess said 15, so I think, yeah. Okay, we'll go with what you said. Okay, so there's some things that happened in 2014. For years, independent living was under the Rehab Services Administration, the same agency that administers the VOC rehab program. Now we have since moved to the Administration on Community Living. So that happened in 2014. Also, and the Independent Living Administration was supposed to have been developed. That hasn't really happened yet, okay? It hasn't happened. The fifth core service came about, transition, okay? Transition for youth, transition for people, to keep people out of institutions, and transitioning people from nursing homes and other institutions to the community. And that definition actually goes to include prisons as well. There's some centers, I think, in Florida that are doing some pretty good work around that. There's also a state plan for independent living development. So there's a process for that that's followed. And then there's also Center for Independent Living sign-off authority on the state plan for independent living. So a majority of the centers for independent living, when the state plan for independent living goes in, okay, is developed before it's submitted to the feds, a majority of the centers have to sign off on it. So in Alabama, you'd have to have 3 out of the 4 centers sign off on it. And so, which makes it interesting, some states like California, they have 34 or 35 centers, maybe even more. So they have to have signatures from a majority of those centers. And then there's also a designated state entity that's responsible really strictly more for administrative purposes, not telling the state independent living councils in the centers how to spend the money, but to make sure the money is accounted for, okay? And then also silk autonomy, that the silk should have been autonomous since 1992, but we know that wasn't the case in many states. And so that silk autonomy has been very important. Currently, the designated entity is the Alabama Department of Senior Services. And they seem to have bought in on the whole idea of the silk autonomy. And then the expansion of silk allowable activities. So there are additional activities that silks can do, or state independent living councils can do. For example, resource development, okay, they can do that as well. They can't be doing direct services though. Silks cannot be doing direct services, but they can do things like systems advocacy. This is all clarified. They can do systems advocacy. And they can also do resource development. So the core independent living services and our advocacy, and these core services, 4 of these 5 have been around since the 80s, okay? Advocacy, independent living skills training, peer support, information and referral, and transition. And I mentioned what the transition was, transition from nursing homes and institutions of community, and help prevent those who are at risk from going into nursing homes, and services to post-secondary youth who had an IEP or a 504 plan. That gets a little bit, those definitions, I think get a little bit complicated, but in terms of, well, did you have, I don't know, Josh, for asking people, did they have a youth if they had a IEP, or some may just disclose it, but.
I personally don't think it's all complicated.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, the way centers see it is we want to get services out there to the youth, right? So if you have youth though, if you have, young person, family member who wants services from a center, if they're young, center, youth, or other ages as well. Actually, there's no upper age as far as centers for independent living. I mean, I know we probably serve people in their 90s, 80s and 90s. But youth has been a really important part of that since 2014. And so the network of centers for independent living are the Centers for Independent Living. That's one leg of the stool. The other leg is the Independent Living Council, and then the designated state entity. And the idea is for them to be working together. So I've not been to a meeting in a while, but I think we've got people who want to work together, and I think that probably is working, but as it's supposed to be. But it's been contentious in some states. It has been contentious. I won't lie. And so the Centers for Independent Living, it's the one in Birmingham. Disability Rights and Resources, the website, drradvocates.org. You can look them up. And you can also Google it. Should come up. Will come up if you enter it. Okay. Independent.
They also
And a Facebook page. Yeah. So you can go and like the Facebook page. And Independent Rights and Resources. That's independent R&R.org. So Kent Crenshaw is the director there. So that's R&R.org. So again, you can Google Independent Rights and Resources. Mobile Independent Living Center, that's ilcmobile.org. That's pretty easy there. That's an easy one there. And Disability Resource Network, Davina Patterson. I don't know if Davina is going to be speaking, but Davina will be. You'll be meeting her at drn256.org. We thought we'd go with the area code up there, naming that with the web address. And so the state plan is what, 5 minutes, would you say? Okay. Okay, so the state plan for independent living, it's for 3 years. Now's a great time. You can reach out to the State Independent Living Council and tell them, well, one, you may want to serve, or your family member may want to serve on the State Independent Living Council if you're not already involved, to be part of it, because I know they're looking for membership. Last time I spoke to Kent, he was telling me they were looking for membership, people who want to be active and engaged. And they're also looking for, well, they do have a staff member. His name is Roshane. His name is Roshane. It's Roshane's Bayfield. Roshane Bayfield. But if you call the Montgomery Center, you know, he actually works out of that office. So they can put you right through to Roshane. So he's working as the state coordinator for the Independent Living Council here in the state. So Roshane would be a good person to get to know. But anyway, let's say, I don't know, have y'all had any has everybody had communication with the Center for Independent Living in your community? Yeah. Yeah, some of you have, some of you haven't. So do you think are you in an area where you'd like to see a Center for Independent Living developed? If you are in an area, there are areas, for example, there's no center, although all the centers in the state are assigned a large number of counties, okay? Probably, the amount of funding they get is not enough to cover all those counties. But if you say you're in Dothan and you want to see a Center for Independent Living developed in Dothan, or in Gadsden, or in Tuscaloosa, or other cities, okay, throughout the state, you need to attend you need to talk to the people of the State Independent Living Council and express your desire for that, because that's what the people in Huntsville did. The people of Huntsville, I went up to Huntsville one time, there were like 50 people came out to a meeting saying they wanted a Center for Independent Living in Huntsville. They now have a Center for Independent Living in Huntsville. And so that's something that the Independent Living Council has to take into account when it's developing its plan. So it may not happen right away, but you've at least got to get your foot in the door, okay, to be under consideration. And so if you want to be on the council, it's appointed by the governor for 3-year terms. And as I said, it's autonomy. They develop the state plan for independent living. And majority of the members are people with disabilities, but we have family members, we have people, we have businesses. I mean, so it's fairly broad in terms of, who might serve on a state independent living council. But really, the thing is, the key is that you have a real passion for independent living, and you want to see independent living thrive, and you want to see what's best for people with disabilities in the state. And I won't go into any detail about the designated state entity, but they can keep up to 5% of what they call the Part B funds for their administration. Current issues, I'm sorry, we're probably running out of time, but consumer control is an issue, that consumers are still in charge, okay, at the centers. That's still a current issue. That disability leadership, okay, is related to that consumer control. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's something that I think that centers have got to be working towards if they're not working towards that already. And so I think that's important. Some centers have been struggling with that. I think others have adopted and moving and doing really well. Social justice, seeing disability rights as part of that as part of the social justice movement. Okay, being part of a social, so that we're not working in silos, so we maybe working with Centers for Independent Living, maybe working with other groups, like the local NAACP, or other organizations that represent other groups in their communities. For example, LGBTQ community. Are there people from the LGBTQ community that centers are working with, so that we're not in these silos, and we want to be working to support them, but we also want those groups to be supporting us as well. Did you see recently where Reverend Barber with Poor People's March was kicked out of a movie theater? I think it was in South Carolina. I don't know if you know Reverend Barber, but he runs the Poor People's March. And so he was kicked out of it because, he has a mobility impairment. And he brought in, I think maybe he brought in his own chair, is I think what happened. And they kicked him out of the movie theater. And this was within the last 6 months. And so anyway, there's a lot of work that we need to be doing together and can be doing together. And resources, Independent Living Research Utilization, ilru.org. I mean, just a trove of really great information on independent living. That's probably one of the top ones you need to find. The National Council on Independent Living, www.nickel.org. April, the Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living, www.april-rural.org. They have great youth programs, okay? Very active youth programs. And so if you're interested in youth programs, and they define youth up to age 30. So they have some amazing youth programs. So if you have relatives who want to get involved in that, in their youth programs, they do them virtually, and April is known, going back since the very beginning, been known for the work they've been doing with youth. And so I would encourage you to reach out. You can maybe ask for Mary Willard. Mary Willard at April. You can find them online and ask to speak with Mary about that. There are other staff there. I'm not sure who's still. I know one staff member was out on sick leave. I don't know if she's come back yet, but Mary would be a great person to talk to. And then the Administration on Community Living, you can Google that. It's kind of hard to find independent living. You're going to have to search, but in their search bar, type Centers for Independent Living or Independent Living, and you should be able to find them. So anyway, there is something. Oh.
So, this is Jess. Related to the current issues, I just wanted to inform everybody, we were talking about this morning. I follow a bunch of deaf advocates on Instagram, which is a great resource for me. TikTok, I like Instagram a little bit better. But one of my favorite women to follow is Crunches and Spice. Yes, you know who she is. Yeah. She released a video about 48 hours ago, and I want to make it work because now it's heading the Newsline. We've had a lot of Newsline last week, but there's been, people talking about related to independent living, even though the case is related to homeless, but we know that 40% of people who are homeless have a disability. And right now, currently, the Supreme Court has decided to take a case known as City of Grant Pass, Oregon versus Gloria Johnson to determine if under our Constitution, a local government can make it a crime to involuntarily live outside and unsheltered when adequate shelter is not available. So anyways, that's something to bring up to you guys because we're starting to see again now a surge of everything with the independent living movement we have. We've done a lot of work, but because of COVID and everything, if you look at the data for when people are tracking funding for how well funding is being used for home-based community services versus long-term service, which is considered institutionalization, we're starting to see it's more 50-50, and last data we have is 2020, but we know there's been an issue in terms of data tracking because of COVID pandemic. So I thought it was important to point that out because it relates to current issues.
Sure.
And I believe in the truth of nothing about us all as well. So that is a Supreme Court case if you want to watch it in terms of current issues.
Can you post it in the discussion on Facebook?
The PIPA discussion one, I think I'm in that Facebook group. I'm terrible. I don't like Facebook. I actually have Facebook, but I don't use it.
Not on
So-
Facebook, but in the canvas.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll get it down.
Yeah, and Bernard Ward to say that it related to disability leadership. People are not aware, but actually in section 504, because I did digging when I recently wrote a letter to the State Department of Education on lack of deaf representation on a committee they had created to determine deaf education in Alabama. If you want to know the clause in section 504, so it's 34 CFR 104.4 B1 BI. Specifically states that in point 6, a recipient of federal financial assistance of any type in providing a benefit or service may not directly through contractual or licensing or on the basis of handicap, deny any qualified handicapped person the opportunity to participate as a member of planning or advisory boards. And so this is something I like to give to people who are self-advocates, especially disabled advocates, because I find this is a bit bigger push you can use, that it's actually in section 504, but it's like we've seen with history repeated, a lot of people don't understand, and section 504 is very comprehensive, you know? And so the ADA, so it's easy to get lost in all the different parts of this different sections. But I like to let people know that it's a big tool in their toolbox. When people say that, oh, we don't need a disabled person on this panel in terms of planning stuff, it's within the law as well. So.
Yeah, all great points, Jess. If I would say, I don't know if it's gone out yet, but no big hurry, but Linda's going to be sending out a link. Oh, okay, it's on there. Okay, there's going to be there's a group called Empower Her, okay? And they have done some amazing work, okay? And so they're going to do, you saw Crip Camp, okay? Last night, they're going to be doing a summer camp in, I think it's in the Catskills in upstate New York, where they're going to bring young women in, or really girls, ages 13 to 18 or 19. They're going to bring them up for a week, okay? And for mentoring, and they're going to continue that mentoring process for an entire year. So if you know any young girls or young women who might want to participate they're now taking applications. So anyway, so when you go online to see that, I'd want to encourage you to look at that. Yeah, because it could be, in fact, one of the staff I used to work with at April is part of that. Her name is Abby Ritter, amazing musician, by the way, but Abby is part of that as well. So I'd want to encourage you, if you know anybody you think might be able to benefit from that, is to go ahead and apply, be part of it. So anyway.
Now to clarify, not giving legal advice. I am not an attorney. I'm just reading stuff and in process becoming ADA certified applicant, not necessarily under like independent, but more for the purpose. A lot of the people I work with as deaf applicant in school districts typically get pushed into 504 plans. So that's where I have to learn a lot related to 504 because that type of work that I do. Because typically deaf children who were raised more with hearing technologies and spoken language with some sign or just spoken language only, they typically get kicked out of IEP plans a lot quicker, which leads to a lot of lack of services and stuff because they're too high performing.
but it's related to effective communication access, which is under section 504. So anyways, I could have an entire lecture about that, but we're not lecturing about it today. That would be an entire lecture another time.
Well, thank you very much, both of
Thank
you.
you.
Wonderful, another wonderful day. Do you have any questions or any comments real quick? I know our time is up for it, but any brief? All right, round of applause. We're gonna pick up your forms, but first we have a special guest and she'd like to say a few words. Angela Richardson was a Pippa graduate last year. And she came by to see you all. She's going to be presenting later on in the sessions. So she just wanted to come and meet you all and give you a few helpful words and tips.
Let me just get to my notes so I make sure I don't forget anything. So I'm Angela Richardson, and right now I serve as the Partners Alumni Liaison. And so I actually, like Linda said, I finished last April. And when I started Partners, I was actually working from home, navigating the world for my son because he's neurodivergent. And I homeschool him as well as his sister. And I briefly worked with Michelle in retail management. And however, Partners has opened many doors. And some of the doors that it's opened is that right now I'm serving on 4 committees. And so that goes to what Jess just said, is that it has to be someone who is affected or a family member that has seen the course to know how to navigate systems change. And so right now I serve on the Governor's Office on Disabilities for the Birmingham office. I also serve for the Center for Excellence on Developmental Disabilities Council and the steering committee for AHEAD at UAB, as well as the legislative committee. And that's a lot of committees. So keeping your schedule all together, but it's really fulfilling because you get to have conversations with people and actually influence the changes that you want to see. And currently, I'm actually also working under Linda in a part-time capacity at UAB, where I'm serving as the family leader trainee through the Pediatric Pulmonary Center. And I love doing this because, and it's just short-term, it's just a year. However, the benefits of it is that they actually honor lived experience. And so lived experience is basically equal to a college degree. And when you think about it, you are the expert when it comes to your individual situation or circumstance. And you know something based on what you've experienced that people in administration may not know. And think about it this way. This is a college level program. So make sure you actually apply yourself as thoroughly as possible. And in doing so, you're going to actually open doors for yourself. And look at this as an opportunity to also be able to network. You'll be able to meet speakers. You'll be able to attend conferences. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I'm actually doing next week is I'm going to attend a conference in Florida for 3 or 4 days. And it's a family leader conference where I'll get to network with other family members. And I'm really excited about it. I actually have to do an interview and create a podcast behind it. So, so I'm really excited about it, but it's a lot of fun because you're still learning. It's and remember this is, and I love the fact that they actually mentioned it a couple of times in their presentation, is that a lot of this has to do with rights and civil rights. And when you think about it, that's what advocacy is. And whether you are a spiritual person or not, or you want to take it from the legal aspect, there are so many different metaphors you can use. When you think about the example of Moses, you know, young Moses tried to assert his authority, and because he had been raised as an Egyptian, and he killed an Egyptian and then had to run away for 40 years. But then he comes back after he's been humbled and trained. And that's what this program does. It allows you to hone your skills and allow you to be trained so that you learn to work as a group. and as a group with each other, but also when you leave or finish and you go sit on these committees to work with groups of other people. Also this week, as a part of the PPC, I got to meet 6 other PPC groups. And so now we have to work collectively on a project together. And so when you can do that and not realize that you're actually working by yourself is great. And in regards to the civil rights plug, often I think about the movie, The Butler. And when you think about it, there are 2 forms of advocacy going on in that movie. You have his son, Lewis, who runs for office and is protesting out in the front. But you also have Forrest Whitaker, who's in the background having these meaningful conversations with influential people, namely the president. So when you think about that, it's really powerful. And I've got to have some really great conversations. I got to speak with Commissioner Janet Elizabeth Bertishaw. I also got to speak with Commissioner Kimberly Boswell. And so when you get to talk to them about what's important to you, and they've all said, when you get that going, please bring that back to me, and I will make sure I take it to the person that needs it so that it keeps traction and keeps moving. And so think about that. And even in regard to your projects, don't let it overwhelm you. Keep in mind that Linda and Brooklyn are going to present people who are already working on projects that you may be able to join, or you can take it from what your own ideas and develop your own project. So don't let that overwhelm you. And they're so patient, you will be able to finish the program. Finish the program. There's nothing in here that's too hard. And you have resources, even if you want to reach out to me or Jess, because Jess and I were in the same class. So we're more than happy to help you in any capacity that we can.